Welcome everyone to meeting number 3. We're one meeting closer to the end of our meetings. I hope everybody had a great holiday. We had a pretty interesting meeting last time, and we're going to finish up discussion on one of those issues from our last meeting. We've got 3 important issues on our agenda this evening: the Urban Village Horizons, the Signature Project Policy, and changes as it might relate to affordable housing and commercial space, and then we have the residential uses in neighborhood business districts. Before we begin the meeting, I know there was a letter, and it was a recent letter, January 29th, that we received, and I think Teresa wanted to comment on that before we started the meeting today.
Thank you, Chair. Just very briefly, I wanted to thank the task force members, Melanie for starting a really important conversation, and for several task force members for submitting your really important and thoughtful comments to the task force. I think your letters reflect the urgency that we are living in and the considerable period of change that we are living in also at the state, the regional, and the local level. The challenge for us is to translate that urgency and those concerns into policy recommendations, right, for the council within the context of the scope that they provided. So I think it's important to attempt to do that. We will work with staff after this meeting to identify where we can incorporate some of these questions. And David had a really good suggestion as well, that even if not within the scope of the council-approved work plan for us, we can always make recommendations via letter or some other means at the end of this process to the council that they address some of these issues urgently. So thank you. I just wanted to comment and just acknowledge the good work that you all did and appreciate your time.
Okay, we're going to move to item 2, task force recommendations on urban village horizons. We're going to proceed in this order. There'll be a staff presentation by Jared on this issue. We will take public comment on that before there will be task force discussion and voting. There are 2 separate issues that are before us on this one. One is, what's the consensus from the task force about the horizons? How do you want to deal with those? And then secondly, if we eliminate the horizons, what kind of priority setting process do we want to pursue as set forth in attachment A? And so keep those 2 issues in mind. They're 2 separate issues, but again, what we'll do first is we'll have the staff presentation, then public comment, and then a discussion by the task force. So, Jared?
Thank you, David. All right, we'll jump right in. So to pick up where we left off on our discussion of planning horizons, I want to recap staff's recommendations from the November task force meeting. Staff did not recommend any wholesale shifts to Horizon 2 at this time, given recent shifts of multiple urban villages to Horizon 1 and other metrics. But staff did recommend shifting the 5 Wounds BART and 24th Street urban villages to Horizon 1 based on anticipated growth as part of the BART Phase 2 extension to San Jose, City Council direction to explore allowing key properties in these villages to develop with mixed use, and VTA's recent transit-oriented community study. As part of the discussion in November, the question was asked why the general plan has horizons and what might result from eliminating them altogether. To quickly recap from last month, removing horizons from the general plan would not change the path for housing, in that an urban village plan is still needed for housing to move forward. However, there are 3 key exceptions that do allow housing to move forward in urban villages ahead of a plan, 2 of which the task force is considering policy updates to. Those 3 exceptions are sites with an underlying residential general plan land use designation, signature projects, and 100% affordable housing projects. So removing horizons would effectively eliminate the need to analyze opening new growth horizons in future four-year reviews, or carry out the one-off shifts of urban villages to the current planning horizons during annual reviews, which has generally been the practice currently. Additionally, the residential pool policy would no longer be applicable, and if you recall, the staff and the task force have already recommended eliminating the pool policy. Oh, I'm not sure why that highlights there. Okay. Where is our? Okay, sorry, little technical glitch there. So of note, some just to note, so if another function of Horizons has been to provide general direction on the prioritization of urban village planning efforts. To that end, if Horizons were eliminated, staff recommends minor amendments to policy IP 2.10 that currently outlines broad priorities for urban village planning to incorporate reference to market demand as prioritized factor, which has effectively been the city's current practice. And with that, that concludes staff's presentation on Horizons. I'll turn it back to the chairs for public comment and task force discussion.
If you could as well, Jared.
And we're going to get a correction on the slide here so that the task force can view the proposed recommendation.
So I would say
It's
task
already
force,
on
I
here
would
as well.
go ahead and look at it while they're fixing that. An attachment A in your packet has this policy as it exists with additional language recommended or proposed that's underlined.
Okay, this is attachment A that's attached to the overview memo. It's about, I think it's 2 or 3 pages. So actually, Jared or Michael, would you explain where this would fit in the event that the task force decides to eliminate the plan horizons?
Yeah, so here's the slide we were looking for. So again, just to recap, so Horizons also, they help inform where staff is going to go out and prepare our urban village plans. There's currently there's some broad language in the general plan currently that directs where we would prioritize our efforts. But then there's other direction we've gotten. As an example, last 4-year review, the task force recommended that we concentrate on Horizon 2 light rail villages. And then there's also been we've gotten direction from council to focus our efforts in areas where there's market demand as well. So our recommendation here is to update policy 2.10 if in fact the task force wants to recommend eliminating horizons, to add in the piece about in the case of high market demand, that the preparation of urban village plans would be prioritized there, as well as what the current language already spells out.
Okay. So we can have more questions on that if people have questions on it, but before we do that, I'd like to open it up for public comment on this time. And if there are members of the public here tonight who want to comment specifically, and we're only dealing with this one issue right now, which is the plan horizons and the recommendations that are in attachment A, please step forward if anyone has any comments on that issue. There's going to be opportunity later on in the meeting to talk about the other agenda items, affordable housing, the signature policy project, the MBDs. But just for now, we're just looking for comments on the plan horizons and the attachment A recommendations. Is there anyone who would like to address the task force? All right. So let's move to this. I'd like to separate, before somebody makes a motion, what I'd like to do first is let's just does anybody want clarification or questions? And this is not a sneak way to get a motion made. It's just questions and clarifications. And Kevin, I see you've got your name up, and Sean, you'll be next. Okay, go ahead.
So I have a question for staff. So in your opinion, which of these two options gets us the most housing soonest?
And when you mean options in terms of either leaving the horizons in place or?
With the changes that you guys were, with the original staff recommendation, keep the horizons in place and move a couple up,
Right.
or eliminate and use your suggested language as the policy.
Right. Yeah, there's effectively not much of a difference in terms of moving housing forward when it comes down to it. You still need an urban village plan in place for housing to proceed, except for when you have the three exceptions being a property with a general plan designation that already allows housing, 100% housing project, signature projects, or 100% affordable projects. So the difference, again, would be, this would not be something we would need to discuss during the next 4-year review in terms of moving to the future horizons. And there was not a need, for the pool policy as well.
Yeah, if I can just elaborate, I think, I think staff recognizes the need for horizons is not really that needed anymore in many ways. I know we're keeping our original recommendation, but I think what we're saying is it's neither here nor there, the purpose of the horizons. Originally, the thought was that, when you do an urban village plan, it doesn't mean you would move up a village in horizon. So the horizons would actually be more static, except for every 4 years, this group would update them. But effectively, what's happened is anytime that there's market demand or interest in doing a village, we do a village. When we're done, we're like, well, let's not wait. Let's get this ball rolling. Let's get this train rolling. So either the staff recommends and then the council recommends and approves moving that village into Horizon 1. So effectively, it's a little bit like the pool policy, to be honest with you. It's not having a lot of sway either way. So there is I think we've heard voices that say, well, why have horizons? I think at a certain extent, we're kind of agreeing with that.
Anything further, Kevin?
No,
Okay, Sean, and then Leslie.
So my question is how would staff determine which areas are exhibiting high market demand?
Well, I think we would, so one, we talk to the development community. Two, what happens is developers start contacting us. We start getting calls and, hey, this property over here, we get people submitting prelims. And so, so one is proactively asking, but we also get a lot of people contacting us.
So my concern with that approach as a developer is when we're going to invest dollars into a project, we need to have a certain level of clarity, visibility into what's going to happen in a particular time frame. So if we're truly interested in generating housing, as a developer, it makes sense to me to do that planning in advance of project applications being submitted.
No, actually,
in those
could
areas.
I stop you there? We're gonna have a discussion. I just want to do questions at this time,
Yeah,
questions.
That's what I'm getting,
Okay.
Mike.
I heard expression of opinion, but I just want to make sure we get all the questions answered, and then we're going to go around and everybody can start expressing opinions, making motions, that kind of thing. So,
Okay.
okay, thanks, Sean. Leslie, and then Harvey, do you have yours up? Okay, Leslie, then Harvey. Questions?
I just had a quick question about new state legislation and whether or not this impacted the horizons as far as being able to move forward without plans.
Where's Johnny? I mean, from what our look at it, we don't believe it does, but we're still analyzing that.
Okay, I think that's a critical question to have the answer to. I guess the next one was one that I've raised before, which is on the new RENA numbers that are coming forward, because I know HCD will not allow you to count units that you can't determine could be built in that 7-year period, 7 or 8 year period. And so it seems like that could be an impediment to you as well. So,
Sure. So, and the reason we don't think that the state law affects this one is because the land use designation of the later Horizon villages are commercial. So it's a commercial land use designation with commercial zoning. So that's why. And I think, yeah, so RENA's coming down the pike. We got 3 years to address that and come up with a new housing element. And we'll be relooking at a lot of this stuff in the lenses of RENA, and that's a whole nother conversation. But the amount of housing we may need to plan for could triple. So, I mean, I think there'll be a lot of reworking, rethinking when that comes about.
and last question, I promise. When do you expect to get the RENA numbers? Is it this spring?
Yeah, so what I've been told is this HCD will release the number for the 9-county area in the spring, and I believe I'm on the methodology committee. We're developing the methodology or making recommendations on the methodology from now to April. And once that's done, I believe the board has to approve that. And then what they'll do is they'll throw that number into the methodology. And I'm not sure the exact date. I'm guessing in the fall, the numbers will roll out for the individual jurisdictions. I'm not totally sure on that. That's my best guess.
All right.
It's already happened for SoCal and San Diego and Sacramento, and they got some pretty damn big numbers.
Okay, Harvey, questions?
Yes, Michael, if we eliminate the horizons, what does that do to the policy of grading signature projects?
That policy remains. So the signature project policy was a policy for villages that were not in Horizons or don't have a village plan, but the parameter that if you don't have a village plan, you need to do a signature project remains. So signature projects would remain a policy in the general plan. It would be an opportunity for housing to move forward in villages that don't yet have a village plan approved by council.
Okay, on the other side, I'm not sure whether it's Juan or Eric.
I see an arm, but
Eric,
Juan.
question.
No, Juan.
Or Juan, all right, sorry.
So I think I had two questions. As I was reading the first sentence in quotes, at first I wondered where it says in areas proximate to downtown, did it mean and with access to existing and planned transit facilities? And so I wondered if that meant and or. And the reason I wondered is because I know that at the February meeting, the discussion regarding Story Road as a potential urban village will arise. And so then I wondered if Story Road was an urban village, then would this qualify as prioritizing because it would be next to the planned light rail extension?
Sure. I mean, it kind of boils down to punctuation. I would, generally describe it as or, this, again, this kind of lays out broad
Just looking for a yes,
direction.
if that's possible.
Yeah.
Well, I mean,
Yes,
Story Road,
or-
yes. So Story Road is on actually the third most used bus route in the county, bus 25, and light rails looks like it's coming. So the answer is yes.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions? Susan?
Hi. So I was looking at last month's stuff, the memo, and you describe a bike shed and walk shed is, a walk shed is 0.5 miles. But then you said that staff reviewed urban villages with a light rail station within its boundary or within 0.15 mile that are not in Horizon 1. So you were looking at moving from Horizon 2 to Horizon 1, those projects. I'm wondering why not a 0.5 mile? Like, why are you looking to only for things that are super close?
Was this in reference to, I think there was a list of villages that we'd said we might consider moving. We'd
To
also
Horizon
consider
1.
Horizon 1.
Right.
Yeah, I think we were looking at the walk shed rather than probably the bike shed on that. If-
So the bike,
you're looking at a
so
quarter
you
mile.
say that the walk shed is 0.5 miles and a bike shed is 3 miles, but you used 0.15 miles as your limit to which projects would, So that's not a walk shed. That's much less than a walk shed. I just wondered why you used that number instead of 0.5 miles. Because we'd want to include more, like half a mile's not that far to walk to get to the light rail station.
Okay, yeah, understood. Yeah, probably have to
Yeah.
look into that and get back to you on that one.
page is that? We can look later.
It's on page 5 of December's memo, yeah.
Yeah, we'll take a look.
Okay, any other questions? All right, questions? Melanie?
So I'm not sure that I'm totally understanding, I guess, the rationale behind eliminating the horizons and why the difference in priorities couldn't be applied to the horizon framework so that you might address things like the predictability concerns, but still implement the policies that we might support here, if that makes sense. So, you know, if we are wanting to prioritize, say, urban villages that are proximate to downtown, access to the transit, why couldn't those be put into, say, Horizon 1, and then those that are lower level priorities go into a second horizon so that we sort of all know what is coming down the pike?
That's how they are now, and they could be. I mean, I think what staff is saying, we have a recommendation which is much more limited, but I think what we're saying is that the horizons don't really have as much need anymore, except for the purposes of where you plan next. And so we're saying that if horizons were to go away, it's still valuable to have some language that sort of guides staff and council about where we should be thinking about planning next. And that's why this policy actually exists, and we're recommending modifying it. But you're right, if the horizons did stay in the general plan, they would what they're doing now essentially sort of guiding staff about where we are planning next. So council's done that in the past. They directed us to move up urban villages on some light rail lines, and we did. And all that was a signal, okay, staff, when you get money, that's where you're going next.
Melanie, I think staff was just being responsive to task force questions previously regarding eliminating the horizons.
Shiloh, questions?
Can staff talk about so if we eliminate the horizons and we adopt that policy, and specifically on the piece that's bolded, can staff talk about like some worst case scenarios if we were to tack that on? It seems like that's the piece that's a little bit out of sync with the philosophy behind the horizons in the first place.
Honestly, practically, I would not see a lot of change. I mean, I think how things have gone, where there has been strong market demand, let's just take West San Jose for an example, because we'll see projects coming in, and typically the community will have interest in starting the planning process, or there just becomes a need to kick off a planning process. De Anza Boulevard would be another example where we've seen mostly commercial projects, but several projects come forward. A lot of concern from the community about those projects, and then there's kind of a need or a desire to go out and proactively get ahead of that and put a plan in place. So I think I understand. I completely understand the question, and yeah, the priority really more looked before was originally focused on our kind of coming out from downtown where you have strong transit, but it just as the general plan's been implemented and how it's played out, it's the market demand definitely has come into play for those reasons. And,
Okay,
It's just a follow-up.
oh, go ahead.
okay.
And
Just
I think we have limited resources to do these plans, so I think if you're gonna have limited resources, it makes sense to do a plan that won't just sit on the shelf, but there's actually market interest to develop that plan.
Okay. Bonnie, did you have a
I do.
question?
I do. So staff is recommending an if-then proposition. If we eliminate horizons, then we need to do this policy change. But you are not recommending if we eliminate the horizons, not to do the policy change. So the recommendation goes together, part and parcel, correct? You are recommending if we do this, then we also need to do a policy revision. In other words, you couldn't have a motion that says we're going to eliminate it. You would not recommend
Let me,
not having that second part, right?
Bonnie, let me answer that one for you. What I'm going to do, I think we're going to finish up with questions pretty shortly. I'm going to suggest to the task force, the first thing we should need to have a discussion on, vote on, is whether or not to keep the horizons. Depending on that vote, then we'll have the vote on attachment A. Okay? Any other questions? Okay, so let's move to discussions and motions. And as I just suggested, the first issue to talk about and decide is, what is the consensus on the task force with respect to the horizons for the urban villages? And Leslie, you want to go first? And then Pat?
Sure. I just wanted to thank the planning staff for flexibility on this, because honestly, I think that's what we need right now. We need the ability to respond to where development's going to go, because we need to remove any impediments we have to development. One of the things that happens when you do that, when you have effective growth control, is that it has bad ramifications. It increases housing prices. It also, unfortunately, has resulted in displacement as housing developers choose to redevelop residential land as opposed to other kinds of land that they might in urban villages, because they're seeking places to build. So it's really important that we have that flexibility. I am, however, I would say I'm worried that the plans themselves are holding back that opportunity, and so I know it's out of the scope of this task force, but however we can do anything to get those moving forward is very critical, because we need, again, to open up as much land as we can to development to make the need. So personally, I support, I'm not going to make a motion, I'll let somebody else do that, but I support opening up the horizons, because I really do feel that the city needs as much flexibility as it can have to react to where we'll see the development first. Kind of back to Kevin's comment, and I think opening them up would do that.
Thank you, Leslie. Pat Sacedo?
Yes, I would also like to thank staff for the work they've done on this. In regards to what's before us now, whether we should eliminate the horizons or not, I agree with everything Leslie just said. I will make a motion to eliminate the horizons. I believe that it sends a signal to the greater community that San Jose is interested. They want to hear what you believe is an opportunity for development to address some of the serious housing crises issues that we're facing, whether it's affordable housing or market rate housing, whether it's affordable housing developers or market rate developers. We need to remove all barriers. We need to remove all policy that really is not conducive to addressing our housing issue in San Jose. And I believe historically, we've known since the day this general plan has been adopted, the horizons have been an impediment to producing housing. So I'm actually very happy I'm able to make the motion to remove the horizons from the general plan.
And who's making the second to that? Vince? Okay. Eric, you're next, and then Vince next after Eric.
Just two items. At our first meeting, we were given the 4-year review progress report prepared by the staff. And on page 45 of that report, it said, this is the staff talking, quote, "The planning horizons for urban villages may limit the speed at which residential development may occur." That's the staff conclusion in the 4-year progress report on page 45. So it's been acknowledged that it may limit housing production. Secondly, and this is anecdotal as a land use consultant, I can tell you that the horizons are a disincentive for investors and developers looking at our city. Most development is done by people that don't live here, that aren't from San Jose. They're from other states, other countries. And I'm usually the first person they call because they want to evaluate a site and they want to evaluate city policy. And when they see that the site is in, quote, Horizon 3, it's sort of a signal to them that, oh, this is a low priority. This may be a difficult political process to get this site that's in the 3rd tier priority through the process. And so it really is a disincentive having those kinds of rankings on these urban villages.
All right. Vince?
Thank you for the comments and for staff's work on this. Yeah, I think right now, anything that's an impediment to the speed of getting housing production happening right now not only increases prices, but it ignores the fact that we are in a shortage and a crisis right now. And so I wholeheartedly second this motion.
Okay, is there anyone else who wants to comment on the motion? All right, all in favor?
Oh, Juan, did you have,
Did I miss you, Juan? Sorry.
do you want to make a comment?
No, my only comment was that I agree with everyone who spoke that we need to remove barriers. If there are any concerns, there are other ways to address those concerns. And so, yes, I recommend supporting the motion.
Okay. Well, we took a little bit of the climax out of that, but
So close.
all in favor? Any opposed? Harvey, Shiloh, anyone else opposed? All right. I do want to, I support the motion, but I do want to comment, and I think this is true, and if it's not true, I want staff to correct me, but my understanding is that any project that came to the council's attention that was not in the first horizon, and there was a request to move it into the first horizon, were there any projects that the council said no to move from one horizon to another?
You mean in terms of a development proposal, or in terms of, the council is, when staff has recommended moving an urban village from whatever horizon.
That's what I'm talking about,
Into
urban
Horizon
villages,
1.
yeah.
Yes, the council has approved that.
All right. So at least as the council has acted, and I understand, Eric, what you're saying, that it can discourage people from the outset, and I'm not disagreeing with you on that. But at least the council since the adoption of the plan, if there were requests made to advance an urban village, all of those had been approved.
Yes.
Okay, all right. We have a motion on what?
On that, which we,
Oh, okay,
Just
so we're going to go to attachment A, the recommendation, and the language. It's also on page
Two of the
2.
memo. Someone else has to make a motion, because apparently I can't.
Yeah, Eric?
I would move approving it as recommended by staff, and I'd like to speak to that.
Is that a second?
Zito?
Okay. Any comments, discussion on the motion? Eric?
Yeah. So I believe staff's response to Juan's question was that the sequence of commas means or, not and. So if you parse that out, we're talking about the priorities would be things near downtown or things with access to existing and planned transit facilities or adequate infrastructure to support the intensification or proximate to other areas. And then market demand would be another factor. I mean, that seems to cover all the priorities of growth in our city. So with that, I think it's worthy of support.
Okay. Does staff understand the changes Eric's suggesting? Okay. All right. We've got a second.
Oh, yeah. Yes.
Asen?
Can you use the mic, Asen? Excuse me. Thank you.
Just really quickly, the last sentence, growth areas with high market demand shall also be prioritized to ensure that development follows the community's vision for the future. Is it just okay to go ahead and remove the community's vision for the future and just simply say growth areas with high market demand shall also be prioritized to ensure that development is feasible where it makes sense?
I'm sorry, you're asking to remove the word community from that bold sentence? Vision for the future?
No comment?
Okay. You're in the queue, Jim. I was just want to make sure, you have a question. I'm not sure I've heard an answer yet from staff.
So I don't know if that's a question of staff, or is that a question for the task force to discuss?
For the maker of the motion.
Yeah, or the maker of the motion.
If someone wants to make an amendment, they can. I think it's fine how it is.
Yeah. Because I think you're saying stop it here.
Yeah, so I think the statement is fine, but I don't quite think that it follows that areas with high market demand being prioritized follows the community's vision for the future. And so just simply saying that growth areas with high market demand shall also be prioritized to ensure that development can occur where it's feasible makes a lot more sense.
That's smart.
If I could just explain sort of
Yeah.
our thinking on this. So I think an example is the Tri-Village area, not San Ramon, whatever, Pleasanton, blah, blah, blah. But Winchester, Santana Row, Stevens Creek, urban villages. And so I think this kind of came from that, where there was a lot of development happening and the community felt that it was just going forward and there was not a vision for that area that had a stakeholder input and buy-in to. So the idea is that if you're having a lot of development coming forward, you want to get ahead of that and work with stakeholders in the community, which is a very broad definition. It's not just residents, it's business owners, developers, property owners, nonprofits. It's a huge, very broad definition of the community that you can kind of coalesce and come up with some agreement on what the vision should be and how you're going to get there so that the development that follows implements that vision and is consistent with the vision. So that's the rationale for us writing it the way it is, include the community's vision.
All right, thank you. Eric, it's your motion. What do you want to do with Asen's suggestion?
No wordsmithing.
Okay, so your motion's still just to keep it as is? Is that it, just for clarification?
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Okay. Susan?
Yeah, it says access to existing and planned transit facilities. Does that include buses or only light rail?
That includes buses.
Okay.
Okay, Bonnie?
Yeah, I was just going to say one thing on community engagement. It kind of gets to what Asen was saying, but part of our whole conversation last week was about community engagement, not necessarily the community's vision, but community engagement around the vision. So, and I know Eric doesn't like to wordsmith, but at some point you should have something in there about community engagement as part of the prioritization process. Thank you.
Well, there is a recommendation about community engagement in our next agenda item, so maybe we could follow up with that then. Let's keep going. Shiloh?
So going back to the theme of my question earlier, on the bolded area, I'm wondering if you can, of all of our potential urban villages, our growth areas, is there one where you could see there's a potential for high market demand that you as staff would say, no, we actually shouldn't do an urban village here, but we would be caught in this policy saying, well, this says that we ought to. I'm just trying to anticipate like a worst case scenario where, given staff has finite resources, we need you to be focused on the places where it makes sense to be promoting development. Is there a scenario where there's an urban village that there's a lot of market pressure, but it actually doesn't make sense to go earlier rather than later?
I don't think so.
Okay. Harvey?
Harvey Darnell, neighborhood organization member. So I would say that we need to keep the word community in there, because the community, for example.
We didn't change the.
No,
The motion isn't changed.
I'm just seconding what Eric said, that he didn't want a wordsmith, and I think we should continue that.
Great.
You agree with Eric? Yes. All right.
Sometimes,
Okay.
over the last
Jesse?
12 years, we have agreed.
Go ahead. Jesse?
I just wanted to clarify that the motion, when you're saying no wordsmithing, does for sure include wordsmithing on the and switching to or throughout the language.
That is clear.
Okay.
That is clear.
Just
We are
wanted to
clear
be
on that.
crystal
All right, I think, yeah.
Need a bigger sign.
Yeah.
So I'm here on this task force because I'm involved in the community as a community activist, and I'm just mentioning that so that you understand what's framing my recommendations. And so I do support this, and as we prepare to vote on it, I just remind everybody what was cleared up at the, or for me, cleared up at the last meeting and the one prior, that what we're doing is making recommendations for the next 4 years. This will not be set in stone. We're taking an approach and we're refining it. And if we find that a decision looks really good, but it doesn't work out, well, in 4 years, they may reverse it. So don't feel like you have to make the perfect decision. I think that this is a great decision to make, and I support it.
All right, thank you, Juan. Anyone else? Did I skip anybody? Okay, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, thanks, everyone. We're going to move to the next agenda item, which is completing the discussion on signature projects and changes to policy IP 5-12. And along with that, there are recommendations in here about community engagement, which Bonnie was bringing up, as well as affordable housing. And we've gotten some letters from task force members on that issue as well. So, Jared, I think you're presenting on this one too?
I am.
Okay.
Okay. All right, so we have a handful of items to cover here, so bear with me. I'll try to get through the slides as quickly as possible. So picking back up on our discussion on signature projects and to recap where we left off. At December's meeting, the task force voted to recommend staff's recommendation of signature project criteria updates with 2 changes. One was that projects would only need to provide their fair share of commercial space rather than their above fair share. The other was the eligibility of interior sites for signature projects. The task force voted to set the criteria at 1.5 acres and 100-foot minimum frontage rather than the 3 acres and 150-foot frontages that was proposed by staff. The task force also requested staff look at the impact of the interior site selection recommendation change, so we'll talk about that in a second here. Additionally, there was a discussion on community engagement and affordable housing in the context of signature projects, and the task force asked that staff explore additional engagement requirements for signature projects and to consider incentives for required commercial space for signature projects that build on-site affordable housing units. So just briefly here, on the interior parcel size changes, staff did an analysis and found that 23 additional parcels would be eligible for signature projects compared to the original staff recommendation and the motion passed by the task force. Moving right along. As mentioned, the task force requested that staff explore additional community engagement requirements for signature projects. In terms of the community engagement in the context of the general plan currently includes active community engagement goal CE1, which establishes a goal to develop community awareness and understanding in the land use and public policy issues and empower the community to engage in shaping such policies. The goal includes associated policies on providing transparent, convenient, and accessible outreach process, among other details. The full text of this goal and policies are included in your packet tonight. So one of the policies is to maintain and implement the city's public outreach policy. For those not familiar with the city's public outreach policy for pending land use and development proposals, it's known as Policy 630. And this policy establishes a baseline protocol for dissemination of information and encourages early and frequent communication between city staff, applicants, and the public. On this topic, the city recently completed an audit of the engagement process under Policy 630, which was presented to City Council in April of last year. The audit provided 8 recommendations, 3 of which have been completed, or are underway, including the rollout of community meeting and hearing surveys, creating a neighborhood language map, and implementing plain language guides for public notices. Through the surveys being employed, staff is aggregating feedback to potential updates to Policy 630. A comprehensive update of this policy is not currently on staff's work plan and would need to be prioritized by the City Council. But staff would anticipate about an 18-month process to fully address all the audit recommendations and complete an update of Policy 630. So to refocus here on the signature project policy as it relates to community engagement and high-level general plan policies, staff recognizes that specific and prescriptive outreach requirements are not going to be the most effective as it relates to community engagement, since every community is different and a one-size-fits-all approach is not conducive in this context. Staff has confirmed that state law requirements for objective standards do not apply to community engagement and recommends updating the signature project policy criteria around outreach to focus on the outcome of the engagement process. The proposed policy language displayed here on the slide states that the engagement process should be tailored to the community proximate to the signature project, and rather than relisting the many policies established already in the community engagement section in Chapter 2 of the general plan, the proposed language references back to Goal CE1 and its associated policies. Task Force also asked for staff to explore the possibility of including childcare for signature project community meetings. We looked into this, and given we're a government agency, not surprisingly, traditional childcare poses some liability issues for the city. However, there has been examples in the past where the city has provided supervised activities, yes, in quotes, where project applicants have hired a recreation leader from our parks department to lead supervised activities for children during the meeting. There's some challenges with this, in that kids must be toilet trained, parents are required to sign a waiver, and then we also need the rec leader to volunteer to work those community meetings. It's not mandatory for them. Also talking to staff who've worked on projects that use this service, they found that parents typically kept their children with them anyway. So in this case, staff's not recommending including this as a requirement as part of the signature project policy. An additional request of the task force was for staff to come back with a proposal that would allow signature projects that include on-site affordable housing to reduce their commercial space requirement. For consistency, staff recommends that an affordable housing component of a signature project should be tied to the city's inclusionary housing ordinance as a starting point. Based on this, staff has put forth 3 options for your consideration tonight. But first, I want to just give a quick summary of the city's inclusionary housing ordinance, or IHO. The IHO requires new residential projects with 20 units or more to provide 15% of the units to be affordable. That's 9% at 80% area median income, or AMI, and 6% at 50% AMI. The proposed updates to the IHO to encourage on-site affordable units and facilitate moderate income housing that would change this affordability mix to 5% at 100% AMI, 5% at 60% AMI, and 5% at 50% AMI. And that'll be considered by council later this year, I believe in springtime. There are also alternatives to comply with the IHO, but it has to equal 20% affordable units on site. And then some of these alternatives include dedication of land, acquisition and rehab of existing units, and most commonly used paying an in lieu fee. So before jumping into the details of the 3 options for commercial reduction incentives, there's a few criteria that are consistent in staff's recommendation across all 3 options. That is, to qualify for any incentives, affordable units must be included on site and must exceed the current 15% IHO requirement starting at 20% on-site affordable units to start qualifying for those incentives. No alternatives to the IHO or combination of alternatives would be allowed, meaning a proposed project cannot pay the in lieu fee for the 15% IHO and then just provide 5% on-site affordable units and then benefit from the incentive. Again, the units would be required on-site. Additionally, the housing and commercial components would need to be built concurrently, which is consistent with the current requirements of a signature project. In terms of the percentage reduction in commercial space, staff recommends that with 20% on-site affordable units, a project would receive 15% reduction in commercial space, increasing in increments of 5%, both for the on-site units and incentive, up to 50% on-site units and 45% reduction in commercial space is shown on the table on the slide. So with that, option number one, with this option, it more or less keeps the status quo in that signature projects as they do now can satisfy the 15% IHO requirement by building units on-site or use an alternative such as paying an in lieu fee. With this option, if an applicant proposes to exceed the IHO requirement and build more than 15% of the units on-site, starting at least 20%, they would receive a commercial requirement incentive consistent with the percentages from the last slide. Option two, all signature projects in this option would be required to meet the 15% on-site IHO requirement. The only exception would be being a land donation equivalent to the 20% on-site obligation for alternatives in the IHO. Projects could then take advantage of the commercial requirement incentive by providing over the 15% on-site requirement, again starting at 20% as previously described. So again, the big difference there with option two is that you're starting off with 15% on-site required for all signature projects. Moving to option three, this option is I'd say it's kind of like a pendulum. Similar to option one, the signature projects, they're not required to include on-site affordable units and could use alternatives in the IHO. However, for projects not including on-site affordable housing units, they would be required to provide above fair share of commercial space based on the urban village type. If the project met the 15% on-site requirement of the IHO, the project would then only need to provide their fair share of commercial space. And then if the project proposed over 15% on-site units consistent with the other two options, it could then take advantage of the commercial requirement reduction. So this, basically this table here is a summary of all the three options up for discussion tonight, and it's included in your packets and on your PowerPoint slide printouts. So just briefly, some additional considerations for this incentive are the preservation of key commercial sites that are important to achieving the city's economic development goals. To this end, staff is proposing conducting additional analysis following the conclusion of the task force process to identify large sites at key locations that would be eligible for this incentive, or which would then be ineligible for this incentive, given their location is a key site for commercial development, and then which would be considered as part of the package by City Council later this fall. So this is just a summary here of the recommendations related to signature projects that I just went through. We have the three options around affordable housing and commercial space requirement incentives and updates to the policy language on community engagement. So then now moving along to two additional housing items from the approved scope of work. And I'm going to stop there and see if David or Teresa, did you want to have a discussion kind of on the signature project? They're somewhat related, so we've got them in the same slide deck. But
let me suggest this. We had a very long discussion at our last meeting and a vote that took place. That vote's taken place. There were some requests that staff did follow up on for information. So we have that information in the packet. So that, we don't need to have that vote again. I do want to give an opportunity, though, if there's anyone based on the information that was in the packet, on the questions that were raised at the last meeting on the signature project policy changes, if anybody has questions in regard to the information. We're not talking about the affordability. There was some information you provided with respect to how many signature projects would be affected with the criteria change. Is that what you were bringing up right now?
Right. Well, I was just bringing up, if you wanted to stop and talk about, discuss the signature projects, but, you know, I think these two items are tied together in terms of the mixed income housing, so
Okay.
preferably, I guess we just keep going and we can go through the full presentation.
Let's complete the presentation. What I'd like to do, this is pretty complex stuff, okay? What I'd like to do before we open it up for public comment is after the staff presentation's completed, let's get the questions out because I think that's going to help us understand what's being recommended here. So if you've got, we'll follow up with questions, we'll go to public comment, and then we'll come back and we're going to vote on things. But it's been suggested that we split some of these votes out. For instance, we can discuss the community engagement, we can have a vote on that. I think we'll do that, and then we'll shift to the affordability and the commercial space requirements after that. But feel free, after the staff presentation, let's get the questions out so at least we're all on the same page as to what's being recommended, okay?
Great, thank you, David. So moving along here, the two additional housing items from the approved scope of work. The first is the consideration of allowing mixed income housing to move forward within an urban village ahead of a growth horizon or urban village plan. The other is to explore changes to commercial space requirements for affordable housing development. So both of these items reside in General Plan Policy IP 512 that allows 100% affordable housing projects to develop in urban villages ahead of an approved plan, subject to certain criteria listed here, one of those being that the project should substantially replace existing commercial square footage. On the first item of allowing mixed income housing ahead of a growth horizon or urban village plan, the options presented for the inclusion of affordable housing incentive through the signature projects effectively address this scoping item such that staff does not recommend any changes. The requirements for projects using policy IP 512 are much less than that of signature projects because this policy was intended to facilitate 100% affordable projects. So adding a mixed income component to this policy would effectively disincentivize the use of the signature project policy and thus result in fewer affordable housing units at any level and less commercial development.
Does everybody understand that? Who's confused? There's got to be at least a couple people. So, Jared, could you give a little bit
Sure.
further explanation on that?
Yes, this scoping item was to look at, allowing mixed income housing in the context of this policy to proceed in urban villages ahead of a growth horizon, which the task force has recommended to eliminate horizons, or ahead of a plan. However, with the direction we got from the task force in terms of looking at a incentive for signature projects that include a mixed income component, so where the signature projects are getting an incentive for including affordable housing on site, it effectively, there isn't, we don't see a need to change this policy. We've already done that through the signature project policy. If by introducing the requirements of this policy were set up to facilitate 100% affordable housing projects. So there's not a lot of criteria. There's not the open space requirement. There's not, the commercial requirement is far less than the signature project requirement. So if by introducing a mixed income component into this policy, essentially there'd be no reason for to use a signature project policy. I don't think, I don't see anyone would volunteer for that. So by the recommendations put forth in the signature project policy, we feel like this policy should stay as is and is a good and strong tool to try to facilitate those 100% affordable housing projects and allow those to move forward.
Let me ask the question in a different way because I'm still having a hard time. And let's talk about what staff is recommending to facilitate affordable housing, because that was a direction the council wanted us to look at. So relate that back to some of the things that are being recommended here in the options for inclusionary housing, if you could. I mean,
For signature projects, or?
Well, we don't have to talk about plan horizons anymore because that's moot, correct?
Right.
So,
Yeah, so I think one is where the task force said, hey, staff, look at an affordable housing incentive program and signature projects. So that's an incentive for affordable housing, and that's before you tonight. We presented 3 options that staff are considering. We want to get your feedback on that. You guys can vote on that. In addition, there's 2 parts of this proposed change. I was over there, so I don't think we got into the second part, but there's also a commercial discussion about, no, that's the other one.
That's coming next.
That's coming next, okay. So we'll get to that next. But I think what we're really saying is that, you know, that we're not recommending changing this policy for mixed income for the reasons that Jared said. It will disincentivize use of the signature project policy. We believe it will result in fewer affordable housing units at any level, and we have a concern about the results of less commercial. I should add that we actually really couldn't find we did sort of look at different models, and we didn't really see a mixed income model that, given the existing financial tools that exist and given how development is currently working, that would actually result in a mixed income project. So that's not up here, but that's another sort of some backstory with the process we went through. So we could have recommended, for example, 50% market rate, 50% affordable. We talked about that, but that's not a product that this market is producing. There's not financing tools for that. We don't envision development doing that type of development. So we decided to keep it, we're recommending it, keeping it the way it is, and really giving that sort of jump ahead, head start for really 100% affordable at 80% of area median income or lower, the low income categories.
Hi, I'm Kristen Clements with the Housing Department. I just wanted to add that the purpose of this policy is to give access to markets for land to affordable developers at a rate that's slightly cheaper because it's not open to everybody yet, right? And so therefore, the city and other subsidy providers wouldn't end up bearing the cost of the land that was more expensive had that market been open to everyone yet. And that really is a kind of an open door that should be only open to quite affordable transactions, and that this open door, if you will, we should be focusing on getting that to work as well as we can, rather than opening it up to deals that might be kind of only marginally affordable. Once you start, we discussed moderate income housing quite a bit. Once you start getting into higher rent areas, it started getting much more complicated as to what the rules might be for underwriting, because as the markets go up and down, the rents may or may not be close to what the market would be providing anyway for moderate income families. So it depends. So it got more complicated, and we thought that the basic tool, we didn't want to cause competition unwittingly by raising the AMIs necessarily, to kind of undercut the basic idea of what this policy was doing, which was trying not to raise the subsidy amounts that we would have to be giving to 100% affordable deals.
Okay.
If that makes sense.
I see questions, and I see some confused faces and so forth. Given the size of our task force, I'd really like to make a suggestion here. And what I'd like to do is, everybody's got their overview memo. And I think what I want to do is get us to look at pages 10 that begin with the staff recommendations. There's prior analysis by staff, but on page 10, they are making the recommendations that we're going to discuss tonight. I don't see necessarily we need to have a lot of questions about the community engagement policy, but thereafter, you'll see there are recommendations regarding the commercial requirement reduction incentive. That's at the bottom of page 10. And then on page 11, the 3 options that staff has talked about, as well as the language in IP 5-12 that staff is recommending. That's really the core of what we're going to be voting on tonight. And I know there's some other recommendations from the community as well that differ from those. We'll get to those discussions. But in this part of all getting on the same page, I'd like to suggest that if you have questions, if you can relate them to the recommendations that are on these pages, I think that will help us move this along. So, questions? Okay. Roberta and then Ray.
I feel really stupid right now. So it says 100% of all housing has to be affordable to be a signature project, is that right? Or is it 100% of the 20%, or whatever that number is on page 10?
So policy 512 that you're looking at has nothing to do with signature projects. This is a policy that allows affordable housing to be able to move forward in urban villages where otherwise they could, in the past, they could not. This is a policy that the previous 4-year review task force recommended with staff and the council approved. So it's been around for 4 years. So it allows, basically, it allows a jump ahead essentially for affordable housing. That's 100% affordable. It's all affordable at the low income categories. Very low income, extremely low income, and low income.
Okay, Ray, and then Smita.
I'd actually like to make a request of the chairs. The Signature Policy Project and Policy IP 512 are completely unrelated whatsoever. And I feel like we're going to continue down this path of considerable confusion if we don't separate the two.
We're just dealing with questions. We're not voting on anything now, and I'm just trying to take care of questions before we open up for public comment, and I do agree with you.
Okay, certainly. So should I hold my questions for 512 till later then?
It's
or-
up to you. I think what we're trying to do is all become as educated as we can before we start expressing opinions.
Certainly.
So it's a good time to ask questions if you've got them now.
Okay, certainly. So to staff, with regards to IP 512, I'm curious, and this is from my colleague Leslie, regarding the limitation of scope to urban villages. The Housing Crisis Work Plan called for an examination of commercial requirements in affordable housing citywide, and it seems like this has been a very focused look at just urban villages in the staff return.
Right, good question. So we do have one other item. We have an item as part of the Housing Crisis Work Plan that's looking at the 1.5 acre rule and the commercial requirements for that particular policy. So that's going to be the other one that covers affordable housing projects that can move forward outside of growth areas on those commercial designated land. So we'll be moving forward separately with that recommendation as part of the Housing Crisis Work Plan.
So will that be returning to this body, or is that?
No,
returning to
that'll
council?
be separate to council, yes.
Thank you.
Okay, Smita?
Thank you. I have a question for staff. This is actually just clarification. I apologize if it's a dumb question. I'm not of the planning or development world, and I need a number in my head to help me make this a little more concrete. So can you tell me what a number for the area median income right now just approximate, doesn't have to be exact, just so I have
Bring
something.
the chart with me, I could look it up fast.
Family
I
of
know
four is
that,
135,000, individual 91,000.
oh, sure, Asen knows that. Yeah, say it again, Asen? Were you citing 80% or? Use the mic, Asen.
100% of AMI right now is about 135,000 for Santa Clara County. For a family of four, individual is about 91,000. 80% AMI is about 104,000 for a family of four, and for an individual, about 70-something thousand. I can't remember exactly.
That's why he's good.
What's 3,000 times 421?
To the second power.
Thank you. Okay, Don?
Just informational question for staff, I think, and I apologize for not being able to be with you all right before the holidays, but I was here for the first meeting. Trammell Crow, we're developers. I think we have, what, one other developer here in the room? Two? Excuse me. Thank you. This, to me, is fascinating and productive, and I really enjoy the integration of ideas and consent of direction, and I'm embracing it in that fashion. However, there is my mind is kind of like vibrating because we're talking about kind of these normative directions for what the city is going to look like, which I understand. What I don't get is there's a conspicuous absence of just what is feasible, the math of these ideas. And so I guess for the question for staff is, of this array of scenarios that all make sense, I get how you're arriving at them, how many of them are feasible? Do you have underwriting math? Do you have pro forma math for any of these in today's environment, recognizing it will change over time? But have we tested any of these for feasibility? And if I'm a council member, when you make this presentation, okay, you have 15 scenarios here. How many of them are feasible today? What would be your answer?
So the answer is no and yes. So because we weren't given a lot of time to develop a proposal, we for the signature, I'm talking about everyone, just so I'm talking about the signature project affordable housing incentive. Please remove this policy from the board. Thank you, so people don't get confused. So we didn't have time to test these. We're presenting 3 options to the task force. Depending on what the task force recommends and where staff, we also may want to go somewhere too, but the next step would be to test them financially and do an analysis of them. We may need to do that depending on what moves forward. And based on that analysis, it may need further refinement or work. We don't know. So that would be a next step before it would go back to council. So right now we're just saying, here's some 3 options we can continue to study. Do they all look good? None of them look good. Modify one. We like 2. Whatever.
And just to finish the question back to the chair, I understand what you just said. It still doesn't make sense to me. From our approach, we would have some sample math right now, so we're not spinning our wheels and creating hope for these aspirational directions that have, for the sake of discussion, have no chance of ever working. So my encouragement is somewhere along the way we might be able to have a segment to talk about that, because as I look at this, I'm dubious that much of this works today. And so that's a concern of mine of coming up with this, so much effort, so many hours from the community in this task force, and basically baking a cake that'll never get out of the oven, if you will.
Okay.
So, thank you.
So I just want to try to remind people, we're just asking some questions, informational questions at this time. I really want to discourage anybody expressing opinions before we get public comment. And I understand where you started on that, Don, so thank you for that. So just to let you know, I've got about 7 people with questions. And so I think, Roberta, you've had your hand up, or are you still going? No?
Okay, got it.
Who else is there on the right? Is Juan? Okay, question?
So I can see how it got confusing. Could we go back to the other slide that we were talking about? Although I very much appreciate Don Little's commentary and agree with what he's saying. So I think when we're here, here's what I'm trying to understand. I think what I'm hearing is that council asked staff to consider changes to this policy. Staff considered changes and determined that the best thing to do was to make no changes. And given that we are recommending eliminating Horizons, then as an example, if Story Road was designated as an urban village, even before the plan was created, a developer could move forward with affordable housing because that's what this allows. And is that what we're saying?
So we are recommending some changes to this policy. It's a little bit later in the slide deck. So we're just not recommending changes to the affordability level. We're recommending that it stay at 100% affordability level, 80% or less AMI. That's a recommendation for that component of the policy. We are making recommendations to reduce the commercial, reduce and clarify the commercial space replacement requirement, as well as eliminating a couple of the other criteria that we feel are no longer relevant.
But that's coming next.
Yeah,
We're not
so,
there
so
yet.
let me just go back. I recommend that we stick to the scope of this slide before we move on, because then it just gets confusing. And I wonder, are we going to be asked to vote on each one of these? Because if we're going to ask to vote on this one, then
Yeah,
we
we're going to
probably-
separate out the votes, so just questions.
Yeah. Well, I
anything-
recommend, let me just recommend that we tackle them one by one, because then it becomes, otherwise it becomes overwhelming.
That's what I just said.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Vince, did you have a question? No. Melanie, did you have a question?
Yes. So on the affordable housing incentives, was there any consideration to try and square some of the requirements for putting in affordable housing with the new and old state density laws? Because some of these requirements don't actually match up with what someone might propose to, say, get a density bonus. They might have 15% low income, but then not qualify for any of the incentives. So is there any, I guess, thought to having more congruence between state incentives and local incentives?
So state density bonus law, there's now also a density bonus, by the way, that's different for 100% affordable projects than for market rate projects. And so the rules are different. Different financial structures for affordable housing can differ quite a bit, and depending on your sources, there's no necessarily rhyme or reason to the income levels. There's no one pattern to really match up to. So no, we did not necessarily try to match any given AMI kind of area median income pattern on this.
But correct me if I'm wrong, so we do see people that are doing 100% affordable housing development that do density bonus. So they're not asking for more density, they're asking for the concessions, maybe a concession on setbacks or parking or other things.
And just to be clear, I'm not talking about 100% affordable housing. I'm actually talking about market rate, like the signature projects that are using density bonuses and other incentives to incorporate a certain percentage of affordable on-site. And so it seems like this policy isn't squaring up with some of the other criteria or incentives. And so you've got this, maybe you might want to reduce your commercial space, so you go this route, but then that means you might actually put less units than you would if you were using the other incentives that are out there.
We could take a look at that, yeah.
Okay, Jesse, then Jim Zito.
I have 3 questions. On the 3 options, which does staff believe will produce the greatest number of affordable housing units? That's the first one. I can list them all if you want them all together.
So, I don't think we know that. I think that gets back to doing some financial feasibility, frankly. So our intention is not to have affordable requirements so high that we kill the project. So I think, there's an option, is it option 1, where, you can just go ahead and do a signature project. You can do IHO by paying your way out. But if you want to get the incentive, you can if you build affordable on site. But we haven't tested, well, gee, would someone actually do that or not? So I know that in the case of ETA, because you have your own policy parameters, you guys would. But would a market rate developer do that? That's something we'd have to test. If you had a requirement for on-site affordable, just at the get-go, no matter what, and then you can get incentive on top of that, we'd have to test that too. I mean, we've heard concerns that if developers have to do on-site affordable, they won't build. Now in Santa Clara, they have to do, city of Santa Clara, where my wife works, they have to do on-site affordable, and the developers do it. So, and then they move on and build the rest of it. But we'd have to test that here in San Jose.
My second question is, can you discuss the background and thought on the commercial discount matrix and how you guys came up with those connections on percentage discounts?
Not really. I think this is perhaps illustrative. I mean, until, to your point, there's not been a feasibility analysis about, this has two concepts behind it. One is a financial feasibility component, right? Which is if you do more affordable housing, you're not as able to do, from a feasibility perspective, as much commercial space. The second point is that, are you doing community serving kind of ground floor use? And therefore, it's a planning concept as to how much space you've got and what you're allocating it towards. And so you've got both a financial and a planning concept there. We tried to come up with something that was a happy medium, that would not drive anyone, that was compatible with the inclusionary requirements and would not drive anybody away from signature and towards other alternatives too heavily in 5% increments instead of 1% increments. There's not too much magic. So I think it's more conceptual than.
Yes, it is conceptual. I think this is a little bit, to be honest, it's a little bit of an art, because we really only had about 2 weeks to put this together. So it's a concept, and I think the next stage would be to actually test it out financially. What is the value of, say, 20% affordable versus 15% commercial reduction? So this is more of a concept that you kind of, as you scale one up, the other scales down accordingly. It could be exactly the same, or one could be more or less. We have to figure that out.
And then my third question was on the 100% affordable housing projects. There's language there that talks about excluding sites that are 2 acres or larger and sites that are on intersections or that have anticipated market demand within the next 10 to 15 years for commercial. Can you discuss the intent behind that language?
Yes, I can. So we had a powwow at City Hall amongst all the different departments, including Office of Economic Development. And I think there is a concern on staff that while there could be sites that are fine to let go on regards to commercial, let it reduce, there are those sites out there that are really opportune for new commercial or expansion or enhancement of existing commercial. And when you do an urban village plan, you can figure that out. This is before an urban village plan. So staff is just letting you know that we are going to do additional analysis to potentially suggest criteria for council's consideration about, yes, but in the case of this, a parcel that meets these criteria, this would not be applicable to. You'd still need to provide the commercial at the signature policy level. Things that could be is a parcel on a intersection of 2 major arterials that has traffic volumes above X, that is over a certain size. Things like that. We haven't really figured that out yet, but that's something we want to look at, because there's really a concern that we haven't been able to do the thorough analysis because we haven't in the urban village plan, and we may be giving up some prime commercial sites.
So there will be some follow-up on what a major intersection is.
Yeah, and this, to be frank, this will be happening after the task force process. We won't be able to complete it in the next month or 2.
Okay. Jim, Zito, then Jason.
Thank you. I thought maybe I had this down, but let me just get a clarification. So if you had a 100% commercial site, what is the potential impact of this on a site like that that's just a plain site that's 100% commercial?
Well, so anytime you have a commercial site, when you build housing on it, that can or often will preclude the redevelopment of that site for a more intense commercial use. Housing, I don't want to use an analogy, you say it all the time, but when you build housing, it's for a long time, multi-generational. So it takes that land off the table for the possibility for redevelopment. So that's, I think, that's why we have that sort of fourth thing that we put up there that we really want to dig, as staff dig in to understand that.
So let me get a little bit more to the point. Being appointed to represent Evergreen, we have the foothills. We have that commercial land that's been sitting there for forever, and it's always comes up as something to discuss. How would this policy affect that land?
It would not affect that land, and that this is specifically for urban villages.
Okay.
The policy would, so it wouldn't apply to that particular.
I thought that was the
growth area.
case. I wanted the clarification. Thank you very much.
Okay, Jason, then Leslie. Cool.
Thank you. You mentioned that policy 5.12 was added in the last update. How many projects were able to go through this since then?
We've had, right, so we've had one project was recently approved using this particular policy, and then I believe we have 2 in the pipeline. I know we have one under review that's submitted an application. We either have another one, I think, that's either has submitted an application or we've processed a preliminary review application for. And I think we've had some other preliminary review applications come through, so there's been some interest. But yeah, we've had one project entitled thus far.
And just to kind of a follow-up, outside of the ones that you mentioned, kind of if there's any other conversations about having these types of projects, other than the commercial requirement, are there other kind of obstacles that are in the way of getting this project going?
Yes, there is. So I think the biggest one is Prop 13 and the property owners. So there was a site on Monterey, I'm gonna use an example. Rome developer was looking at a site on Monterey Highway. We said, I'm sorry, I'm sorry. What I'm describing is actually not this policy, but it was the other policy. So I want to back up, but it applies to both. So the issue is that what's happening with affordable housing developers is that when they approach a property owner, the property, maybe it was bought in 1957. It's been in the family for years. It's under Prop 13. Their taxes are low. They have income on the property, and they're like, well, yeah, I'll sell it to you for $1 trillion. So there's not a lot of incentive for them to sell. And when they do, it's the price they're asking for is financially infeasible to make an affordable housing developer work. So there's a lot of we understand there's a lot of challenges all around, and some of the challenges are just trying to find a site where they can buy it that works.
Okay.
Thank you.
Leslie, and then Kevin, and then we're going to open up for public comment.
I just wanted to clarify a comment that was made about the commercial space requirements only being applicable to the 1.5 acre sites. There's nothing in the housing work plan that limits that to that. It says that the city will explore changes to commercial space requirements for affordable developments, and in our view, that's citywide.
Right. So the 1.5 acre rule is it's a specific work item to update that policy and the commercial requirements. It's a specific item in the housing crisis work plan, and then the item for the 4-year review was intended to focus on IP 512. So we are moving forward with updates to that policy too, in terms of the address concerns around the commercial requirements for that particular policy, and that'll probably be moving forward ahead of the recommendations from as part of the 4-year review related to IP 512.
Okay, this is not something that's clear at all, by the way, and I don't understand why there would be different projects with different commercial requirements for affordable housing, because the problems relate to all.
Well,
and that's not something that I read in the housing crisis work plan.
So staff's goal is that we have the same for both policies. So as we talk about this, the thinking is it would be the same in the other policies.
And for everything that's outside of them too.
Well, yes, I don't know what other policies have that requirement in
No,
it.
I was just saying that you have a 1.5 acre rule, which is very limited, and you've only had one project in the last 4 years that has applied through that, and then you have housing in urban villages. So it'd be everything except for those, which is a lot.
So just one more reminder, just questions.
Trying to get clarity.
Kevin, and then I did see Ray and Bonnie. Did you have yours up? Okay, so, and Shiloh, okay.
So can we go back to the one that's the commercial incentive, sorry, the incentive 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, that one? So I believe it was when the item was brought up last time, and then it was brought up too in the SV at Home letter, that another way to think of the incentive would be like a 1-for-1. If you add more affordable square footage, you decrease the commercial square footage on a 1-to-1 basis. Did you guys look at that? Can you talk about why you suggested this instead of that way? And if you're going to do the financial feasibility study, could you study both?
Sure, yeah, good question. Yes, we did look at that. We looked at a 1-for-1, and where we were trying to balance kind of, various goals here on both offering this option, facilitating affordable units on site with reduction of commercial, but then also still looking at the overall goals of the signature project policy and economic development goals. And so this is where we landed kind of, but we did look at that exact scenario when we were kind of bouncing the different ideas and how this might play out. We looked at a 1-for-1, and then we thought, well, it'd probably be more simple to go by 5% increments, but we did look at a kind of matching, as you're saying, like 20% reduction, 25% affordable housing, 25% reduction. So that is something we considered and we could look at in future financial analysis.
Could I just add to that for a sec? When you put out 20% affordable, it's 5% more than the inclusionary requires. So really, you're doing 5% extra, and you'd get a 15% reduction of commercial. And so it's a ratio, and the fact that affordable is much more expensive than the commercial space, which is empty, that concept was based generally on some assessments that staff has been seeing by consultants for other projects going on right now about how much it costs to do relative different pieces of work for value capture kind of analysis. So basic concept, not precise, but that's kind of where it was coming from.
Okay, Ray, question?
Just a question to the chair on process. Will staff be completing their current presentation before public comment with the remainder of the items?
Well, we have the, I thought we did it on this issue. We haven't done the neighborhood business district yet.
There's remaining items. Staff didn't complete the IP 512 section
I
of the
thought we had,
presentation.
but was there a further presentation you had?
There's a couple more slides.
Oh, there are?
Yeah. Yeah, there's more.
Let's make it
Yeah,
more
so-
complicated.
Yeah. I can promise, I think I can promise this next.
Don't promise?
Yeah, it's not as complicated as the last one. So the criteria with commercial, I think, is a little bit more straightforward. Okay, so where were we?
You know what? I'm just going to suggest this. This is all in our packet. You're just going over things that are in our packet. I've read the packet. Everyone's supposed to come here prepared for that. We're running late. So if there's questions about it, now's the time to ask the questions, but I don't want to take up time, especially since we're running late, to go over things that are already in our packet. So if there are questions on this, and I don't want to cut off anybody, we're taking a lot of time before we even get to the public comment on this. Any further questions, whether it's these last few slides, anything again on this, because the policy is set forth here on page 11? Okay, Bonnie?
Yeah, real fast. So you have three options, and the question is if they are all equally feasible and you haven't yet done a financial feasibility study on any of them, then is it necessary that we choose one option as opposed to any of them? In other words, yeah, do we have to choose an option when you haven't done a feasibility testing
I think
study?
what we're asking to you do some of these, or is there ones that we are worth studying? So none of this stuff, let's move on, let's leave it the way
Okay.
it is, or,
So the question is, you don't necessarily have to choose one. You could choose one, you could choose
Correct.
two, you could choose three, and then you're going to have, terrific, thank you.
yeah.
Good question. Okay. Shiloh?
So stop me if we've been discussing so much that I'm not sure what I'm asking is within the scope of what we're talking about. So if it's not, feel free to say, no, we're going to discuss that next. But on page 2 of the memo, under signature project policy, the second bullet talks about site selection for signature project would be revised to a 1.5 acre minimum size. And the rest there. And I'm wondering if staff can just comment on the pros and cons of reducing that, in particular as it relates to like the future cohesion of an urban village and the aesthetic of an urban village.
Yeah, so you invited.
Okay,
you
never
invited-
mind then.
Yeah, okay.
You supported
Thanks,
it.
All right. I'd like to thank members. Okay. Sam, sorry I missed you.
Yeah, I do have a question in terms of if our goal is to generate the most number of affordable housing possible. So on the slide that has 3 different options, and if we were to look at the different percentages of affordable housing and how it changes the commercial, reduction of commercial, lack of the feasibility study, it makes it a little difficult, but if you were to look at these percentages here, what would be an optimal percentage for affordable housing that would be that would help us achieve the affordable housing the best?
Well, I would just point out that option 1 does not require inclusionary even be met. And option 3 does not require it if extra commercial is provided. And so option 2 is the only one that even requires basic inclusionary units are even built. And so if you're looking to optimize the likelihood that affordable housing is built, option 2 is the one that does that best.
Okay.
I would just add that option 2 theoretically would create the most affordable housing, but we'd have to test that to ensure that such a policy would not discourage the market rate development from going forward, because if there's no market rate development going forward, there's no affordable going with it. So that's what we need to test.
Okay, we're moving to public comment. We'd invite members of the public to step forward and provide us your comments with regard to the signature project policy, the changes to policy IP 5.12, as well as the recommendations for affordable housing incentives, the options that have been set forth in the staff memorandum. Anyone wish to address the task force? And it can be generally on the issue of affordable housing. Hi, could you state your name, please? No.
Got it. Sorry.
Thank you.
Jared, could you go to the community engagement slide, if you would be so kind, with the suggested language?
Yes, would you introduce yourself, please?
Be happy to. My name is Alex Shore. I'm the Executive Director of Catalyze SV. We submitted a letter to you all, forgive me for the late notice, last night, and wanted to just check in with you on some of the language in this policy. Concerned that the general plan goal CE-1 is exactly that, just a goal. And so if we're going to be creating a signature project policy that refers back to a goal, it's not necessarily creating particular requirements. As I understand the signature project policy, we allow projects to move through the process quicker outside of the urban village process so that we can get high-quality projects that provide a model for how the urban village is going to evolve. If we're going to do that, then we have to have substantive, meaningful, measurable community engagement steps to help developers get the best ideas from the most diverse group of people in the community into the hands of the city and the developer. So, of course, you're going to tailor every community engagement strategy to the project. That would be basic good practices for anything you're doing. But I think we might want to create some measurables here that might allow staff to have some specific requirements around signature projects. We also had some particular questions. If you keep the language in this current framing with the idea of it's saying community where the project is located, we would just recommend cutting out the language where the project is located, so it's as broad and diverse a group of stakeholders as possible. And we'd also suggest that you say collect the feedback of the design, potential benefits and quality of the project. The goal being there that we want folks thinking about the most potential benefits of a project, that's the goal of community engagement. Get the great ideas from the community into the hands of the city and the developer to build the best signature projects possible.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Next, please.
Good evening, members of the task force. David Lowe. I'm speaking on behalf of Destination Home, and we're here to speak about the commercial space requirement changes that are being proposed for the 100% affordable developments. Hopefully, you've had a chance to take a look at the letter that we submitted. It's in your packets, along with 4 of our nonprofit housing developers. And I think it'll help demonstrate why we have some concern about how the current requirements are limiting affordable housing development. If you look at some of these real-world examples, you'll see that because of just the limits on space, requiring to put commercial space in there or reducing the amount of units we're getting by up to 30% per project. And of course, adding more costs onto these nonprofit developers that just don't have a very big margin to deal with and could threaten the long-term viability of these projects, which we want to hope to provide affordable homes for 45, 50, 55 years. So we hope that you'll go a step further than what the staff's proposing. Instead of just a 50% reduction in commercial space, an elimination of these requirements for those 100% affordable developments. We think that'll be an important step we can take towards getting the amount of affordable housing we need in our commuting. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please.
I'm Robert Reese, a resident of the Villages in Evergreen. I have 2 requests for this policy. If you might consider taking those portions of 630, which encourage early and frequent communication between the applicant, the city, and the public. I'm thinking that this early communication, before there's even pricing established on the land, the terms, that if the development community understands the community's aspirations, we might be able to get something more. Also, if the task force would like to nudge the council along and have the update to 630 be done this year, I think that's important, because if it's not done this year, with the due date being in 2021, it's going to be in 2023, maybe 2024. The reason I'm asking this is in the information provided by staff previously, it talked about how community participation can help a project be more accepted by the community, and I'm using the community in the broadest sense of that word. There was also a talk of perhaps having fewer hearings, maybe having the status of projects being held with the Planning Commission and no longer going to the council. This dovetails with what's going on at the state level for objective standards, what we're doing with the citywide design standards in terms of making things more predictable, so that if you are going to a system that's going to have more things vested with the planning commission, the decision-making process, and not the council, you're going to have a lot of folks surprised. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, please.
Good evening. My name is Jason Uhlencott. I'm a resident of District 6, and I'd like to express my support for a recent memo by Planning Commissioner Melanie Griswold, which had some very interesting ideas, including a form-based code, elimination of minimum parking requirements, which I see is tied very closely to our climate goals, and ending the prohibition on the conversion of industrial land. I think that last one has some very valuable anti-displacement effects. We need a lot more homes, but the best place to put them is where we don't have existing homes. So I hope some or all of these ideas can be adopted. Thank you.
Thank you.
Robert Geary. All right. So there's a couple of things I'd like to see included in these plans. One is discussion about displacement. Because if you're going to be building something in some location, you are more than likely going to be displacing people. And so I'd like to see something included that would address that. The other thing is the one that you had on there that had the chart with all the different menu items on there of how you can get out of providing affordable housing in your project. One of those things is supplying land. But you didn't say where that land has to be located. I could give you some land in San Bernardino, because it doesn't really say where that land is. So I think you should be a little more clear about, if you're going to be doing in lieu fees, we know that that's in American dollars. But if you're giving land, where is that land? So I think that needs to be tightened up a little. Thank you.
Thank you. And if there are other people who wish to make comment, please line up. Thank you.
Hello. Hi.
Good evening.
My question is, in this climate, or the situation with housing, why is in lieu fee still being discussed? And if you're going to include that, please be prepared to explain that to us residents why.
All right,
Thank
thank you
you.
very much. Anyone else? Okay, we're going to move to discussion by the task force. Ray's pointed this out, that there's a number of different things that are up for discussion. I think it makes sense, as you've suggested, to separate some of those things out. So one of the issues, and we've had some public comment just now on that, is the community engagement policy. You'll see it in the overview memo. It's on page 3, and the right. So it's also at, I think the language that was up on the screen is on the bottom of page 4. So are we all on the same page? Okay. Okay. Page 4 as well as page 10. All right. So let's take up this issue first. Does someone wish to make a motion with respect to the staff recommendation on community engagement? Okay, I see some hands. So let's start with Juan, then Bonnie, and then Councilmember Foley.
I motion that we adopt the recommendation.
Second.
Bonnie?
No, I agree.
Okay. Discussion on that motion. Anyone? Jim?
Yeah, I was wondering, create a tailored community engagement strategy. It's still kind of 30,000 feet. I was wondering if we could have some specifics in there that make it a little bit more, how can I say, guiding? Maybe a minimum number of engagement dates, if you will, or something along those lines. What usually ends up happening a lot is the community says, you have to engage us, and they say, yeah, we had our one meeting, and that's enough of that, you know? So we want to make sure that there is some level of minimum baseline. Is that possible? I realize it says a tailored community engagement strategy, but that doesn't really put much guideline there.
Well, you could put that in there. There's no question you can, and you're certainly welcome to make a recommendation on that. My role here is not to make motions or to amend them, but I would say this, just in response to that, Jim, and I guess I can say this as a former council member without having to worry about things I say necessarily now. And Margie and Pat, you could jump in too, and Linda. We have a lot of former council members here. Obviously, each of these districts are going to have a high degree of involvement of the district council member who represents that. They are responsible for the community. And whether they do their job well or not, people are always apt to criticize that. They're doing too much, or projects, if you're on the development side, it's going too slow. And just expressing my own opinion, I'd like to think this language about tailored community engagement allows a council member and the city and the staff to look at projects individually and to make assessments about how much involvement, especially the early involvement that was being recommended, and that we as task force members to start putting in mandatory requirements might be, in some cases, too little, and in some cases, too much. And if somebody disagrees from the community about whether a council member did their job, there's going to be consequences for that. So I'm speaking to the, I'm sorry it took this long because I'm doing the exact opposite I've been asking everybody else not to do.
So you have Jesse and Shiloh.
I'm just saying less is more, and letting the council and the staff work out something is better. So Shiloh, Jesse.
So I wanted to just state for the record, as a planning commissioner, when we've been seeing these signature projects, and the developer complies with what's currently on the books, and it's, one community meeting, and it's a signature project, it's been pretty disappointing. And so I just wanted to state what I, as a planning commissioner, would like to see, and I believe that this language allows flexibility, which I like. And that is, when a developer comes before us and they're like, well, the city, we did this tailored thing and the city told us to do X, Y, and Z, and we did it. And you know what? We went above and beyond, and we did all this other stuff too. And in fact, there's 10 people here in support of the project. That's kind of what I'm looking for, and I just wanted to state that for all the developers who are eagerly listening into this, this group of folks, because that is my expectation.
Okay, thank you. Jesse?
It's actually Harvey.
Oh, Harvey, sorry.
When I read through this online engagement, I wanted to make sure that at this point in time, we're not considering that online engagement would preclude having a community meeting. Okay. So I wanted to make sure that that was not, that you're not moving to an electronic world where, in my neighborhood, being a transitional neighborhood, we have the electronic haves and the have-nots, and they like coming to meetings.
Yeah, it's not. I think if there was a digital people and a digital community that wanted only digital online outreach, that would be tailor-made to them, but it doesn't, we're not saying that, it's not precluding one or the other. All that stuff's to be determined later.
Well, who makes that decision?
I think we would be working with the council office, and our intention is not moving towards digital. That's another vehicle, but we don't see it as a replacement for.
No, I understand it's an adjunct, but at this
Yeah, I
point, I want to make sure that it isn't the primary.
Sam, did you have a comment?
Yeah, quick comment here. I do agree with Jim in terms of community engagement. It is really important that even though we know the word tailor does send a message that we would customize it according to needs, but that's not everybody interpretation. Maybe I think we should consider somewhere having language where there's a minimum number of community engagement events where we can ensure that it takes place so that it's not one, it's not two, it's not three, up to interpretation at a certain time by certain people. And then secondly, that 1 out of every 3 members of our San Jose community are first-generation Americans. I think it would be very important for us to also pay attention to engaging them in a way that really is inclusive, because that will ensure the long-term sustainability of what we try to do, not only in the goodwill that we generate, but also building a community in the process.
Okay, thank you. Teresa?
Yeah, I support the motion. I do think it's important to comment though on page 4 when they're talking about how on policy 6-30, that the council can choose to prioritize that policy in its budget setting process, which they are undergoing right now. And I think it's very important for us all individually and organizationally to support the council's prioritization of community outreach and ensure that there are staff resources dedicated to effective multilingual, multicultural community outreach, consistent processes.
Okay, we have a motion on the floor. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Okay, thank you. We're going to now go to the affordability issue and the linkage as well to the commercial incentives to that. These policies are set forth in part on pages 10 through 11 with the different percentages as well as the three options that staff has recommended. I want to separate that out for the moment from IP Policy 5.12. Councilmember Foley, I think you had some comments on that.
I do. The council is committed to building more affordable housing and to encourage that development in any way that we can. But this is really a complicated issue. Given that we do not have the financial feasibility study, I would move that we move this conversation, we defer this conversation to the city council to decide and have them look at the feasibility. I would also include in that motion that staff work with the development community to work on those feasibility numbers. And again, the reason for that, the council is very dedicated and committed to affordable housing, but clearly without the numbers here, and we're not going to have the numbers while we're in session as a task force, that this really should go to city council for the council to discuss and implement, and that's the current body that should go forward, and we could go forward more quickly that way. Thank you.
Okay, comments on the motion? Was there a second?
Yeah,
Yes.
two.
Okay.
Second.
All right. Discussion on the motion. Let's start on the left side here. We'll start here at the beginning. Michael, are you, okay?
Hi, I'm actually disappointed that this is going to be tabled. I mean, I think we've been discussing the commercial requirements are actually, disincentivizing housing. So it's a pretty well-known fact that, in fact, even in some of the recommendations that have been proposed, there's been an attempt by staff to look at incentives for affordable housing, but to defer it is just going to continue the same old thing. I'm seeing in the next item, there's items about replacement, 100% replacement of commercial. This is an opportunity. I have a project, I've mentioned this, in Blossom Valley. It's on a light rail station. Under the signature project, 234 housing units on roughly 3 acres would be required to do 18,000 square feet of commercial at Blossom Hill and Highway 85. I don't think you have to be an economist to note that that's a lot of commercial. So again, pushing this off to council, I think is wrong. I will not be supporting the motion.
Can I ask you a question, Michael, that might assist in the discussion here? As I take your comments, you do want to see reduction in commercial space to be used as an incentive for affordable housing. Is that something you support?
Correct.
And I think we've received letters from other people as well in that regard. And so, Councilmember Foley, with regard to your motion, are you amendable to the idea that if this were to go back to the council, that it be with the recommendation that the council develop a policy that incorporates commercial reductions as incentives for housing development?
Absolutely. In fact, no, never mind, I can't say that because I may violate a Brown Act, so yes. I'll just say that, yes.
Does the seconder agree?
I think the issue here, and maybe others are going to speak to this. I heard Don Little comment on this. I heard other people, Bonnie and others, that there's some questions about the formula that staff came up with. And frankly, it sounded like it was a struggle somewhat, that how are you going to relate a reduction in commercial to more affordability? And I think there was a sense here that, you know, we don't want to just have a weak recommendation going to the council based on one meeting without any financial analysis or feasibility, I think, as was being discussed. But on the other hand, too, I don't think we want to leave this discussion without a clear message to the council that this is something we do want to see. So I see the motion trying to strike a balance on that.
Absolutely. I'm sorry, I should have included that or be more clear in my motion that we should direct staff to include the reduction or elimination of the commercial linkage or the commercial requirement.
So it might be beneficial for our discussion here to hear from people whether you think it would be of benefit to not adopt specific percentages now, but, or let a further financial feasibility occur before those are fixed. Kevin, I know you've written a letter on this with others.
Yeah, I mean, I'll let others speak to the letter as well who are part of it. I mean, I think the task force should have go on record with a really strong message that we want council to look at reductions in commercial space that get us the most affordable housing units while still having feasible projects that can move forward. So, and then I don't really want the task force to get stuck on the specific formulas because I think it'll just take too long. But I don't want to miss the opportunity for us to say that we need to reduce. We want to provide the reduction of commercial space as an incentive
Okay.
to provide more affordable units.
Thank you, Kevin. Leslie?
I agree with the motion with a couple of additions. One is we did submit a memo to the record that suggests another alternative that we would like the staff to look at as well. We actually have looked at it and done our own feasibility, and so we do know that it is feasible, so we'd like to put that in the mix. Frankly, I've done a lot of development, and when I look at that up there, it's scary. I'm not sure at all how it works, and so I think that whatever we come up with needs to be simple. So in addition to what Kevin just said, and David, what you said as the chair, I would really emphasize the need to bring in the development community as part of this feasibility analysis and look at some real projects and see how this works. And then the last thing that I would suggest, and I would hope that we may be able to make this part of the motion, would be a timeline of sorts. I don't want to be looking at this a year from now, 2 years from now. Really would like to have it come back quickly.
So rather than, make amendments to the motion, let's hear comments from everybody on if other people like Leslie have some suggestions to enhance the motion. Let's hear those, and then maybe Councilmember Foley, you can kind of keep track of that, because we don't have a city clerk here.
I just asked who's writing this down.
Yeah.
I guess it's me.
How much are you getting paid, by the way? Yeah, see if you can keep track of that, and then maybe you could summarize this. Let's keep going on this side of the table. Vince?
I'll be supporting the motion, but I have a question for staff. When is this issue coming to council? I think that's a good point.
The plan is we would be going to council in December.
Okay.
And so the plan would be that between now and going to planning commission, we would be doing this financial analysis, develop a recommendation based on the task force, recommendation, and we would be presenting that to council for its consideration.
No.
So the recommendation would come as part of the full package of recommendations for the 4-year review. It would stick with this process, but
Yeah.
we would use we would go off and do the analysis that's being asked of us and then bring that forward with all the other recommendations as part of the 4-year review in fall.
With the stakeholder work.
Okay.
Yeah, so we're proposing that this piece of work would be kept as part of this package of work going to councils with the short answer.
sure that's what the motion.
That's not my motion.
Oh, it isn't?
No,
Okay,
it is
so,
not.
well.
My
we'll
motion
defer to
is
you.
to to be clear, to expedite it and to remove it from a decision by this body. We are voting, if we vote today, we are voting to refer this to council to review and make the decision detached from the recommendations from the general plan task force revision. So my thinking is that it would come to us way before December 2020.
I'm, okay.
Yeah.
Well.
Yeah.
I know, I hear.
Here.
I'm not, yeah, I mean, I think you can bifurcate it. We'll have to look at it, whether we can,
Yeah. So, thank you, Chair and Co-Chair Rosalind Huey, Director of Planning, Building, and Code Enforcement. So, Councilmember Foley, the staff concern is that we don't have the capacity, actually, to bring the item, to pull it out, separate it from this task force process, and to get it to council any earlier. We have a number of items on the citywide planning work plan, and we just don't have the resources to accelerate it. Again, you know, when we consider the scope for the task force, our plan is to complete the task force meetings, get all of the recommendations by April. In the spring and summer months, we have to do the environmental analysis work, and then we package everything and present it to Planning Commission and Council in the fall. So that's the process for the 4-year review. And to pull this out, I just honestly, I don't think we have the resources to do that.
Okay, let's continue with some comments on the policy,
Yeah,
which is ultimately what we're here for. We're going to have to deal with how quickly it can be implemented, whatever it may be. But Bonnie?
Okay, so I'm going to support Councilmember Foley's motion, but, so there's two aspects here. One is that I think there should be a strong task force recommendation that we as a task force are committed to more affordable housing and whatever sort of incentivization we can have. Any of these options, as you've said, are feasible, so let's explore them. So that's one thing I think that we can do as a task force to symbolize that we care about the issue. The second is the issue itself, how it will proceed. And in that sense, I agree, if we can, expedite it as much as possible, as Councilmember Foley has said, but to separate it from our ability to do feasibility analysis, because right here tonight, we don't have a formula. So once again, we should say our support. We should allow you to do the feasibility along with developers, as many have said, and we should try to expedite it as soon as possible, as the council member has said. Thank you.
Is that Melanie or Steve? Melanie? Okay.
So I've got a question about the feasibility, and when we are talking about feasibility, are we talking about feasibility from the developer side of whether projects are financially feasible based on these recommendations, or whether if we implement these recommendations, whether it's financially feasible to the city based on tax revenue from decreased commercial requirements?
No, so I think what we're hearing the task force talk about is that the outcome you'd like to see is incentivize affordable housing. So we need to understand, would it incentivize affordable housing? So we need to understand that. But at the same time, to be frank, I mean, I think we do also want to see some amount of commercial. So you could just get rid of all the commercial, and you would obviously might incentivize affordable housing more. But so it's a balancing act, because we're trying to achieve multiple goals. But what we've heard from the task force is the goal is to really incentivize affordable housing. So understanding like how those ratios work to make sure a project's feasible and it would incentivize affordable housing.
So I guess
We're not looking at it from tax revenue.
looking at it from then of how do we move this forward and staff resources, having staff look at the financial feasibility seems to be not as effective as putting out these options to the development community. And if they're not financially feasible, it's not going to happen. And so if it's, if it's not enough of an incentive, you're not going to see the development community taking advantage of it. If it is an adequate incentive, then you're going to see some affordable housing units being built. So
Yeah,
I
Melanie,
guess
I did understand the motion to include specifically working with the development community to evaluate feasibility. So I think that's part of the motion, isn't that correct? Okay. Councilmember Davis?
Thank you. Regarding the timeline and based on what you said, Rosalind, I think taking this to December to the council is actually too late, because that means that this issue then wouldn't be settled enough to be in the EIR. So wouldn't it make sense timeline-wise to have this come to the council before April so that it can be included in the full package of all the general plan updates?
It shouldn't, we don't anticipate this is going to affect the environmental, and if need be, we can include a number of options, but we don't anticipate this will affect the environmental analysis.
And the other thing I would add is that staff is anticipating that we would need to get a consultant on board to help us with this feasibility analysis. So it's just not staff time, but getting a consultant on board to assist us. And we'll need time to do that. I just don't think it's possible for us to turn it around and present it to council in the spring or summer.
Okay.
Smita and then Sam.
Thank you. I actually just have a clarification. We had correspondence talking about eliminating the commercial requirement for 100% affordable housing. Is that the same thing, or is this mixed, like signature projects, are they different from 100% affordable? Are we talking about the same thing? Two different things? Thanks, that's all I needed.
So, David, are we making is there going to be another vote on reducing the commercial requirements for 100% affordable? That's going to be a different issue?
Different issue.
So right now, we're only talking about this slide that's up on the, is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, so I consider myself to be fairly well-versed in development issues in San Jose. And I got to tell you, I feel like a deer in the headlights. I was thinking about how I would even begin to model this in an Excel spreadsheet. I don't want to table the issue. I feel like we're punting our responsibility as a task force when we do that. But at the same time, I wouldn't even know how to vote on this because I don't understand what the fiscal ramifications are for projects.
Well, I think that was the idea behind the motion, was because I don't think people do understand those things. But I think there's an agreement that there should be incentives for affordable housing, and that one important way to consider those incentives is the reduction of the commercial development requirement. So that's, I think, where we want to go, and I think it was for that reason, Sean, that people didn't necessarily feel comfortable wanting to go and adopt a specific percentage because not knowing if that's going to make a difference, as has been suggested. So I think we might be on the same page on that. Sam?
Yeah, I think that our decision of this task force, one of the most important decisions that we could give input into is this very decision. It's about affordable housing, and we understand the logic of the higher the number of affordable housing that we want to achieve, then we have the more the reduction of the commercial side of that, and we understand that balance is very important for us. I think as a body that we don't negate or to delay that that input process for our body here. My challenge would be is that ultimately the city council will be the body that's going to make a final decision. But I would challenge our staff to help us in terms of coming up with the feasibility study for at least this body has an opportunity to give input before it gets to the council. It may be later in the process. Could it be 3 months? Could it be 6 months? Are we looking at April? Are we looking at July? And if that's doable, I would prefer that this feasible study, ability study be done and be run through this task force at least once. I think that would be a very important community voice that I think we bring to the table before it gets to the final decision by the city council, because they will have a chance to make it better.
Asen?
So first of all, I want to say that I think this is the right framework to try to attack this issue. I think thinking about ways to incentivize affordable housing, especially on-site, can help achieve multiple goals, including through the reduction of commercial space. I think I want to offer some suggestions, I think, as part of the way to think about potentially thinking through the feasibility issues. And I think the first thing would be to look at whether or not you can cross-cut the impact by scale. I think the reduction of commercial space is going to be a much different question for a smaller scale project versus a much larger scale project, like a high-rise. The second thing would be to piggyback off of what Leslie said, would be to try to aim for simplicity as much as possible for the trade-off between the incentivized affordable housing and the reduction in commercial space. And then the last thing would be to make sure that there's still that baseline of what the existing IHO percentage is, so that no matter what the incentive is, it is always above and beyond what the current IHO percentage requirement is for on-site inclusionary housing.
Okay, good comments. Who else? Eric, are you next in line? Okay.
After reading this for the 50th time, I now realized I'm confused. So I have some questions. First of all...
Question period was over.
Yeah. First of all, was it the staff's intent that we would pick one of these options as the policy? Or that all three options are available to a development?
Well, I think where we're going is that.
Not for analysis, I'm talking about, would one of these ultimately be the policy?
Yes, I think what we're saying is we're recommending there should be one policy.
Okay.
The policy could include options, but yeah.
Okay, so, understanding that, then it seems like it would be nice for the task force to narrow down the scenarios that we're analyzing. Because as I read this, like scenario, or option 3 is totally going backwards. We all had a discussion that requiring more than your fair share of commercial in a development is a disincentive. So why would we be studying an option that we know, we've all heard, is a disincentive, and we all voted last meeting not to include in signature projects? So it seems like we should get rid of option 3. And then option 2, I don't understand. So can you explain mechanically how option 2 works?
Sure. So with option 2, this would be a change to the current signature project policy and what has been recommended by the task force, in that all signature projects would have to, at a minimum, meet the 15% on-site IHO requirement. The only alternative accepted would be that dedication of land at 20%. And then the commercial reduction incentives are the same as all the other options, where so the signature project would be required to include that 15% on-site. Then if they wanted to go above and beyond, starting at the 20%, it would qualify for the reduction at that point.
So under this option, the 15% inclusionary requirement is a mandate.
Correct.
This is not an incentive program. So you are imposing a new mandate on market rate housing to provide the 15% inclusionary.
Correct.
On all signature projects.
Correct. So
without exception.
So it'd be an additional. Yes. So we'd be this is proposing to add an additional criteria to be a signature project, that to be a signature project, one of the criteria is providing 15% IHO on-site, or with the, or you could dedicate land.
Yeah. So.
But you could not pay out, write a check in lieu.
Understood. So if we want signature projects of all types to move forward in the city, option 2 and option 3 are disincentives going backwards and will reduce development in the city. Option 1 is the only option that actually provides an incentive. it's a direct incentive, and it's at least it's proposed by staff, it's a scaled incentive option. So I would encourage the task force to narrow the methodology down to the one that's truly an incentive, and let's study the variables of percentages in that incentive program.
All right, you're keeping track of that, Councilmember Foley? Okay. Okay. Councilmember Arenas? Oops, here you go.
I'll get this next, that way you can keep that one. So I'm actually thinking about what the council wanted us to do as a general task force, and that is part of what we're asked to do, what we're deciding today, and to send it back to council, to me, doesn't make sense. If council wanted to do that and wanted to have this decision at the dais, then we would have. But we wanted the input of this task force so that we can have a decision that is collaborative and comprehensive and vetted by many folks that represent the different fields that are in this room. And so I'm going to make a substitute motion to continue to have the decision here at the general task force meeting. And I think, Eric, you kind of helped dwindle down what we can see as the only option that our staff can actually review. I don't know that this decision would be made any quicker at council because the staff's, what you have in terms of projects will remain the same, whether we say that we want it done or the general task force wants it done. The projects that you have are the same. And so I think this gives an opportunity, if we keep it at this level, it gives staff an opportunity to actually really evaluate this, the only option that we have here, and to get, bring back a feasibility study connected with these numbers that could then obviously be taken to council, and everybody else who would like to contribute to that decision or oppose or support it could then do so at that point. But I think we need to formulate a recommendation here. We obviously want to make sure that we have more affordable housing and that we have a decreased commercial space. So I think that's overall, that's a consensus here. I didn't hear anybody say otherwise. So I'd like to make that substitute motion so that we can continue to.
Well, so what I had suggested, I'm going to exercise a little prerogative here. You can yell at me later. Is we're a different body than the council, and we can't function exactly like motions we might do at a council meeting or you might do at a council meeting. We have to do it this more, recognizing we have 40-plus people here, and try to do things as much as we can by consensus. And what I had suggested before was, let's hear comments on the motion, and certainly your comments. Maybe they can be incorporated in there, because I think Eric was getting us to a place. We're going to get to everybody down here. But what we're going to do is, I want to get everyone's comments on the motion first. Give Councilmember Foley an opportunity to reframe her motion. Perhaps that might or might not take into consideration your concern.
I mean, I think as you go down this aisle, you're probably formulating my substitute motion. I just don't see, I'm not supporting the motion as it stands now.
Okay.
I think that the general task force should keep its authority and contribute to what we're going to recommend to the council.
So I just want to clarify for everyone what the motion is. It is to state in our strongest possible terms that we would like to see affordable housing feasibility enhanced in any way possible to reduce and eliminate the commercial requirement. That is to refer, again, to staff, well, let's say, not reduce, but focus on option one as being the only feasible option. That was not in your original motion, so you would have to amend your motion. The part that would be referred is only the specific formulas that are identified there that staff stated that they have not had time to discuss feasibility. That's the only piece that we were going to refer back to council. I think also, as part of your motion, really encouraging an expedited timeline for action to council. I realize there's still question about what staff can do and how quickly, but with that statement that we would like it to be as quick as possible to identify the barriers.
So thank you for restating that, which doesn't really change where I'm, my position, because it actually reaffirms. So if we send it back to council to figure out this formula here, council, what is council going to do is going to send it back to planning, and then planning is going to have to do that work. And so I think we're just going to add another step here where we can use this process to just get it done.
Okay.
Could we move on to the task force, please?
Yes. Yeah, we're going to, I heard Juan, yes, we're going to do that. We're going to get to everybody. Ms. Michelle?
I'd like to suggest a procedural alternative. The level of service policy used to be, the housing crisis of the past. And in order to deal with the two issues, the policy direction and the interpretation of that policy, the City Council adopted a very specific council policy that laid out how the real world could achieve conformance with the general plan policy. The numbers, in other words, were determined through a working process that involved staff and the City Council. And when the council adopted that policy, it was binding in order to conform to the general plan. You had to conform, you had to follow the procedural direction in the policy. So the numbers, for example, here, could be incorporated in a council policy that could legitimately be on a different timeline than the general plan amendment process. The general plan sets the standard, the goal, the objective, and the council is able to, and the nice thing about this is you can modify it when the economy changes, when lots of things change, because it's a different, it's as binding as general plan policy, but it serves a different purpose and is subject to the council's complete control.
So your suggestion would be whatever percentages, if they're worked out in the future, they should be outside the general plan?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Linda, did you have yours up or no? Okay. I do see Juan. Yes.
All right, first let me say that I support Council Member Arenas' substitute motion. I understand it's not a substitute motion. What I was gonna say is I recommended that a new motion be created should the original motion not succeed. And the reason is, I could be mistaken, but I think, one, I agree with everybody here, and that includes staff, because when I read the document that we were provided, I'll read quickly. It says, staff seeks direction from the task force for a preferred alternative or suggestions for other alternatives that should be further studied or considered. All along, staff was saying, not pick one. They're saying, should we perform additional analysis, feasibility study, whatever? And so I think we're all in agreement. The only part I think where there is a disagreement is, should this go to council or should the task force make a recommendation? And here's what I read in the paper we were given. Given the timeline of the task force meetings, this financial analysis would need to be done following the conclusion of the task force process and could result in staff modifying the task force recommendation to City Council. So staff has already planned that if we decide for them to do further study, that they will do so, and that this will go to council. And so it will go to council just as Councilmember Foley has requested, but it will go to council after this task force recommends further analysis as staff requested. And so I recommend that we at some point support Councilmember Arenas' motion when it is made.
Thank you, Juan. Okay. I thought I saw Pat and Roberta. Pat, did you have yours up or no? Roberta, okay.
So two things really stood out. One is about scale.
So a 20-unit development's going to have different issues and different finances and economies of scale than a 1,000-unit development. The other thing that stood out is Leslie said she's already done a feasibility study. It's simple, and I think it works. So my recommendation is we ask anyone here, developers do feasibility studies all day long. They probably do them in their sleep. Why don't we ask the developers and consultants here to bring back their options with a feasibility study at our next meeting or the meeting after that, and we can actually look at the numbers and see what pencils out and achieves the goal. Is anyone here willing to do this? Are you?
I think we can find, our forte right now, our primary focus is on office, and we do residential, but I think, and I don't want to slide this off to the other developers in the room, but I've got to believe we could find two local residential apartment developers that would be willing to come in pro bono and share their high-level math with us. But I'm not just talking about the differential between trade-off between commercial and more residential. I'm just talking about overall, is any of it feasible?
That'd be great.
Yeah.
That's what I'd like to see, so that we get houses built, affordable and market rate.
Is there anybody on the right side I missed here? Okay. Anybody? Okay, let's go to the, okay, Jason.
Just quick secondary comment. I think we want to open it up, right, as far as the framework is concerned, but just want to make sure that we have a couple of things as baselines. Again, one more time, that it has to be above and beyond what the existing IHO inclusionary requirement is. And then I think the second one is, I haven't heard a lot of folks talk about full elimination of commercial requirements for signature projects, and I just want to make sure that that isn't on the table.
Smita?
Thank you. I'll keep this quick. Jared, I have a question for your clarification. When you went through the slides, I thought you said option 1 was basically the status quo. And I'm wondering if we're saying that's the only viable option, if we're just sticking with the status quo.
Sure. What I meant with that is that with option 1, when I said status quo, what I meant is that signature projects now do not have to, are not required to provide on-site affordable units. They can meet the current IHO requirement by either including those units on-site or any of the alternatives. Typically, that would be paying the fee. The other two options are differ in that they differ from what is currently required now of signature projects. Option 2 is I was just mentioning would actually require all signature projects to meet the on-site IHO requirements, and then option 3, you would have various different options if you included the 15% on site, or if you went above. If you included the 15% on site, you would have to meet the fair share of commercial, but then if you included more than the 15%, then you would qualify for the reduction in commercial. So it's kind of like a pendulum on that option.
Yeah, I mean, option 1 is basically the same as it is now, except it's adding on an incentive that isn't there for if you provide affordable, that you can reduce commercial.
Perfect. That was the succinct answer. Thank you.
Okay, we are going, oh, Kristen?
Thank you. I just wanted to say that the modeling, in order for it to be useful, I think probably should be done kind of in different submarkets, and thinking about whether affordable housing subsidies could be applied for the affordable housing units. And so I kind of am not in favor of back of the envelope, high level math, kind of big picture thinking that doesn't kind of meet the way that we regularly analyze things, because different submarkets and different project sizes will come out with different feasibility looks, And it may or may not, people may or may not know to think about tax credits with bonds and whether they should use that or a density bonus execution. I mean, affordable housing is its own little niche of real estate finance, and you don't want to know it if you don't have to, but you shouldn't wing it necessarily. So I would not suggest that we wing this feasibility analysis. I suggest that we ask affordable housing developers to consult with us on what the scope. Yeah, but it's market rate people that may get on, it's right where the two meet. Because it's market rate executions that end up doing 40% affordable housing and seeing if that works, which means that it's a tax credit project potentially. It's, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So it's right where the two meet. This is not for beginners or winging it, in my mind. That's my professional opinion.
Okay, thank you very much. Don, did you have any additional comments? Is yours up? Your tag up?
No, I agree with housing staff. It needs to be done thoughtfully. And I'm not trying to be sand in the gears, flying the ointment here. There's got to be a relatively straightforward business case analysis that satisfies sort of the integrity of the analysis and the complexity of it, that just gives us guidance before we recommend this thinking to the community that, yes, that works, or no, there's significant gaps, here's how we close them. I just don't want to give birth to an idea that will never, ever happen.
Okay, thank you. Carl?
So I've got a couple of observations and a concern. So my observations, I'm not sure if I agree with which council member's motion. I think Councilmember Foley's intent was to move forward some basic concepts that I hear a consensus on. And that's having an incentive that addresses the commercial requirements, consulting those that would be able to do the analysis that Don earlier talked about, because that's what's the missing piece. We can't figure this out if we don't have input from the folks that will do this or not. So, and we're limited by a time frame that I'm not sure if the full analysis can be completed before our job is done. So that's why I'm hearing from staff that's got to come after.
Yeah.
So I don't know how we move forward with the concept that I think we originally started with, which I think we have consensus.
Well, I think your comments are really helpful, Carl, and
So my one
Yeah.
concern is this, and I agree with Eric, in looking at the three options, I think there is only one that is an incentive that we need to focus on. My concern is that the only option? And I don't think we can answer that question until we've engaged the developer, not just the affordable housing developer, but the market rate developer as well, because there's, again, that nexus that we need to figure out.
All right. Thank you, Carl. Margie, did you have yours up, or? No, okay. Jesse?
Yeah, I'd like to second Arenas' motion that's out before the task force. I know you had
Yeah,
said.
it's going to be more of a second in a kind of figurative sense.
Sure.
Okay?
Yeah.
Not a real,
This is
it's not a real.
playing out in ways I'm not
We're
familiar
doing
with,
things
so.
here by consensus, and so what I want to do, and I want to give, if you want to make a motion, you'll have the opportunity to do it, but I do want to give Councilmember Foley a chance to take into account the comments that people have made, and then let's move forward from there. But in
Sure.
keeping with that, go ahead.
So I do think option number one should be our focus. In addition to studying the feasibility of the proposed staff matrix, I think we also need to specifically study the one-for-one discount as outlined by Silicon Valley at Home.
Okay.
There's two other items that I think need to be addressed. The 5% increment needs to be reviewed. That is a tremendous hurdle that I think is actually not an incentive to providing more affordable housing, so that needs to be reviewed. And then further, there's limitation on this, as staff has proposed, that says that it can't be in proximity to intersections that are, I think, commercially oriented or street frontages. And I think we need to weigh, as a task force, a recommendation that says, no, this should apply to all signature projects throughout the urban village plans.
Okay, anyone else on the left side? Other than people who haven't already, I'd like to get comments from people who haven't spoken yet. Is there anybody on the left side who has not spoken yet? Okay. Melanie?
So I wanted to propose basically a friendly amendment to this, which I think echoes some of the comments that we've received through the letters, which is I cannot help but think this is just a drop in the bucket, and that all of this time and effort is being spent talking about signature projects, and that there's been, I think, 8 of them in the city, and we're thinking that this is really going to impact the production of affordable housing, when in reality, it's just such a small number of projects. And so my friendly amendment would be for us to recommend as a general plan task force that these incentives be provided on a wholesale manner to all developments.
Well,
I would consider that a friendly amendment.
but here's the difficulty. Remember what we're dealing with here is let's not deny that affordable housing is a major issue in the city, and you're absolutely correct about the number of urban village plans that have gone forward. But what we're talking about with the specific motion right now is there are commercial development obligations currently in the general plan for urban villages. And what emanated from this was a referral from the council to re-examine that as a means for providing an incentive for housing. So we need to act on it. It was part of the council direction. And if you apply that citywide, there's not necessarily other areas of the city that involve a trade-off or have minimum requirements of commercial development. So it's a bit outside our referral. I'm going to have to be the gatekeeper on that. We have to stick to the things that council sent us. And again, that's not to in any way disagree with you about the broader issue of affordable housing. But the council specifically asked us to look at the policies as it applies to urban villages and incentives for that for commercial reduction of commercial development. So we have to deal with that.
There are minimums for the urban villages too. Like for the approved plans, there's minimum commercial requirements.
Right, right.
So and we have a number of approved urban village plans. So if we were to make a recommendation to allow the reduction of commercial, that would apply to all of the urban villages that are already approved.
Right, but I don't know if you want to take up the issue of retroactivity and changing plans wholesale without community involvement, I think that might be a bit problematic, where those projects went through a community review process and they have a certain mix that's been approved at this point in time. And taking your same comments to heart, it's only 6 of them. It's not going to have a big impact on that. The referral from the council is whether or not this task force is supportive of changing the minimum requirement for commercial development as an incentive for housing. And that's what we need to act on at this task force. Yes, for signature projects as well.
David, respectfully, it doesn't say that. It says explore changes to commercial space requirements for affordable housing developments, period. It does not say specifically for signature projects.
This was, I think this one was brought up by Jesse, not from the council. I think this was something that came up, if I'm not wrong, that it's not council direction. It was something that came out of this task force process, and the staff said they'd come back with it. And I do still have comments.
Okay, go ahead, Leslie.
Just really quickly, I have so many thoughts and so many good ideas, it's kind of hard to think about what to say. I did want to express with Jesse's comment on the 5%,
it doesn't make sense, because as we pointed out in our letter, if you did 24% affordable housing, would you then have a 15% reduction in commercial? Those percentages just don't make a lot of sense. And so I would, agree with Eric and others that have said that option one is the one feasible out of the three that's on the board. But I do think looking at other options, including the one that we've laid out, which is the square footage proposal, is much more clear and easy to implement, and is based on the amount of space, not an artificial percentage.
There are several offline conversations taking place. I think people are trying to figure out the differences in these sections of the memo. We're talking about different policies simultaneously.
Well, and it's because that says signature project,
Exactly.
and it doesn't say it in the memo, so.
So Councilmember Davis mentioned that the slide says signature project, but the memo does not. What portion of the memo, Councilmember?
Oh, it does. So table 2 on page 7, it says summary of affordable housing incentive options, but I just saw it does say the table below provides a summary of all 3 options for affordable housing incentives for signature projects described above. The issue that I'm having, though, is that I don't understand why we're only talking about signature projects, to Melanie's point, because that was not the direction from council. It wasn't to limit the incentives only to signature projects.
Right, I believe the scoping item is specific to IP 512, the other policy, and it comes from the Housing Crisis Work Plan. We'll double check the memo that council approved, but this was.
So yeah, I have the memo here.
And this item here came out of the last task force meeting in terms of direction from the task force for us to look at.
Yeah, so the scope that we were given by council is redistribution of planned growth and urban village boundary modifications. Consider mixed income in policy 512, which we've already talked about. Consider growth horizons, the residential pool policy, which we all got rid of. Modify policy IP 5.5 to provide more flexibility in the urban village planning process. We've done that already. The other one is modify signature project policy to establish appropriate, clear, and more predictable minimum residential densities for signature projects, and establish more clarity on the amount of commercial that will be required for signature projects based on the typology of urban villages in the general plan. For example, local transit urban villages versus neighborhood villages, and that's the scope.
Okay, let's try this. We're moving forward. We're going to move forward. We've heard comments from, I think, everybody at this point, and Councilmember Foley, I'm going to ask you to give your best opportunity at this point to.
Revolt down there. You have a whole section.
No, we've gone around. We've gone around once. We've gone around, and some people have made multiple comments. So what we're going to do at this point is I'm going to give Councilmember Foley an opportunity to modify her motion, and they'll see if there's a second, and then we'll have discussion again on the modified motion.
Okay, so I'm trying again.
Okay?
Okay, trying to get 100% or close to it. So you've all articulated the perspective very well, and I think you're all in agreement that we want to reduce or consider. We want to send the message to City Council, which is me, Councilman Davis, and Councilmember Arenas, and a few others, that we should remove the commercial incentive in order to stimulate development of affordable housing. Wouldn't you all agree that's what we're trying to accomplish today? Yes. The commercial requirement. So I'm going to try to restate the motion as best that I possibly can, because that is the bottom line intent of this motion. And that is that we refer this to council to develop the financial feasibility along with the developer community, which will include market rate and affordable housing developers and SV at home. Leslie, that means you get to be at the table. That it consider a reduction or elimination of the commercial requirement, that we, that they consider option 1, since option 2 and 3 have been eliminated, and they consider which of those items are financially feasible with an expedited timeline. I would also like to include not just signature projects in that, but urban villages in that motion.
Who was that, Bonnie?
Okay.
And the other thing I'd like to add is that it's really important that the developer community be involved in this, because it has to be financially, it has to make financial sense, as was articulated a couple of times. But we want to build affordable housing. Requiring the commercial development piece doesn't make sense sometimes, but we don't know today, and we're not going to know for a long time until a consultant is hired and until the developer community meets with staff and comes up with a number, whether 20% affordable housing will result, and if we build 20% affordable housing, a 15% reduction in commercial will make sense, or whether 25 and 20. We don't know those numbers. That's why we're debating this, and that's why this needs to go further to council. It's not going to come, we will not have time for it to come back to us and make this decision.
Okay, I'm going to call on Ray in just a moment, but just Melanie, I wanted to go back to you. The motion, as I understand it, encompasses all urban villages, not just signature projects. Does that address some of what you were talking about?
It's a good start.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you. Ray?
Here.
Tune up. I just want to be completely clear, because the motion has moved a little bit.
Right.
I don't think we're going to get there tonight. We've talked a lot about affordable housing. The next item, IP 512, speaking specifically to 100% affordable housing development, is a critically important item to get to, and I just want to make sure that doesn't get eaten up by this motion.
Right, we're not forgetting that. Okay. All right. Juan?
So I appreciate all of the collaboration. For me, it's just a little bit confusing, because I think what we're saying is, do we incorporate all the feedback, as you've done wonderfully? And then do we ask council to consider it in an expedited manner rather than a process that's already laid out? And we don't know the answer, right? The council could say no. The full council could say no. And so it could be delayed. And the alternative is the same thing we're doing, because we're not kicking it to council. We're saying, council, we want you to make a decision, but here's all our recommendations. And the alternative is, we say, we as a task force make these recommendations, conduct the study, and so it's the same path, and whatever we recommend will go to council. So I would just recommend a friendly, what I consider a friendly amendment, to change it so that it is a task force recommendation that will result at council anyway, in a guaranteed process.
I'm sorry,
Yes.
I missed what you're.
It's consistent with your memo. That's not
I
what
didn't hear
heard.
what you said, I'm sorry.
Oh, I'm sorry.
I was talking and having
No,
a
no,
side
all
conversation,
is
I
well.
apologize.
Here's my friendly amendment. I suggest that we incorporate Councilmember Arenas' feedback, which is to make all of our recommendations, instead of saying, hey, council, we're not deciding this, but here's all our recommendations, to instead say, hey, council, as we're charged to do, here's our recommendation, which includes everything everybody else said, and we're including it in this guaranteed process that you will consider, that you will make the decision on anyway. And so it's the same plan. It's, the only difference is we're making a recommendation instead of putting it in limbo.
Isn't it consistent? I mean, I don't know that it's any different. Is it? I don't, see anyone feeling that that's inconsistent with what the motion is
The
currently.
motion is currently not to make a recommendation, but to,
It is to make a
the
recommendation.
recommendation
It
is to send it to council instead.
But not to refer the decision.
Okay.
Okay.
It's just the data that comes back.
Right.
Asen was next.
So let's do this. There's confusion here. So we're going to do this a little bit more deliberately. And I'm going to ask Councilmember Foley to restate the motion.
Before she restates the motion.
No, if you
No,
can.
before she restates the
Here-
motion, can I
clear.
make a quick-
I think there's not consensus about what's voted on.
Who's talking right now?
It's Roberta.
Okay, we have to do this a little bit more deliberately. As I understand the motion, Councilmember Foley, we're recommending reduction of commercial requirements as an incentive for affordable housing. Is that true?
That's correct.
Okay, number two,
He's restating, so, and he's the lawyer, so
Well.
go for it.
number two, I heard from Eric, and I want to make sure this is, and by the way, that includes both urban signature projects as well as urban villages, to look at that.
Yes,
And using the methodology in option one.
yes.
Yes, I was going to include that. So we're going to use the methodology that's in option one. We are not adopting the percentages that are set forth in the staff memo, those particular percentages. That will be something that will be subject to a feasibility analysis. And the feasibility analysis will include the groups you previously identified.
That's correct.
Okay. So anything else?
Expedited timeline.
And try to do it as fast as they can. Okay. Juan, understanding that, are you, Juan, understanding that, do you have anything else?
No, I think that if we're making a recommendation, it's gonna be included in the stuff that council will look at in December. And so I think we are now all on the same page, because I think the council members' motions have been combined.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Eric, was there anything further you wanted to add to that? Are you good?
The only thing I didn't hear was including SV at Home and others' recommendations for the square footage scale versus the percentage scale.
Yes. Okay, that's included. The recommendations, the ideas will be part of the study. Carl, you had good comments. You were trying to summarize this. Is there anything else that you would want to see added to the motion? Are you satisfied with it?
No, I think that captures my concerns.
And Asen, you had talked about simplicity, scale, and baseline requirements. Is there anything you wanted to add to the motion?
Just want to add, because I heard it a couple of times, I don't think we're talking about elimination unless I just want to make sure that that's what everyone heard, right?
Reduce or eliminate.
Oh, because I heard reduction, not elimination. Is that what everyone understands, or is everyone understanding elimination as well?
Could you be a little bit more clear?
Yeah, so basically, right now, I think we're talking about having a trade-off between affordable housing and commercial as a reduction, right? Not an elimination of the commercial requirement on sites.
I said reduce or eliminate.
Right,
Reduce
and
or
I
eliminate
just
is
want
what
to
I
make sure that
understand.
that is what everyone understands, as opposed to just a trade-off between affordable housing and commercial with some kind of limitation on the reduction of commercial, so that there is always a baseline of commercial in each one of the projects that are under this incentive.
Okay, so as I understand the motion, it's to study reduction or elimination. Are you preferring to have the motion only be studying reduction, not elimination?
That's my preference, but I'd like to
Okay.
hear others' thoughts.
All right. Jesus?
Yes, that'll be my preference as well. I was just noticing that, and I wanted a clarification in regards to removing, because I hear removing. I believe that we've been discussing about reducing the amount of commercial, and I think that's what I will prefer, reducing, eliminating commercial, especially in areas like, I would say, what is happening to us in Allen Rock. A lot of new developments are coming in, and if we reduce that, or actually eliminate, that will practically change or rezone to residential instead of being a commercial corridor. So I will request to be very careful with that, not eliminating, reducing, I believe is okay, but eliminating will be very detrimental to the small businesses, especially along the urban villages.
Okay. Any
Just
other
for point of
comments?
clarification.
Pat?
I was just going to say, I do support Councilmember Foley's motion with the comments that have been made and the additions, and I also would make a friendly suggestion that we call for a vote, because otherwise we're going to be leaving here tonight with actually nothing happening. So I call for a vote.
Okay.
I just want a clarification that Councilmember Arena's input has been incorporated into the motion. Is that correct? Just want to make sure.
Well, I think you need to ask her if she feels that way.
I think it's still going back to council, adding one additional step, is that right?
I don't feel that it's adding one additional step at all. I feel that
Councilmember-
we're taking action here and moving forward.
So then you're not sending it back to council before it goes to council in December? No. Okay, perfect.
Well, there is a recommendation coming from the task force on this. I hope we've spent at least the 2 hours at least doing that.
Right.
I see clear direction. We've narrowed the options down to one option, and I don't need to restate everything again. So the question's been, Eric, what are you doing there? Oh, you're voting. Oh. I didn't know if that was like, I didn't know.
But there's still a
Okay.
question about reduce versus eliminate.
All right.
No, the motion is reduce or eliminate. It's part of the study.
Got it, thank you.
Okay. The motion's understood. All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, would you keep your hands up, please, just for a moment? So, Jared, could you, or staff, make a note of this, please?
Does it include the reduction or elimination?
Both.
Both. It's a study. Can you count me in?
Yeah.
It includes, the current motion includes elimination.
So the motion was to study the feasibility of reduction or elimination. So it's reduction all the way possible to elimination, depending on feasibility.
Okay. Was staff able to get all that? Okay, thank you. So, as Ray mentioned, we can't skip the other issue. It's equally important, if not more important. We have the policy that's set forth on page 11 of the staff recommendation, IP 5.12, 100% affordable projects. Somebody want to make a motion on that? Ray?
I'll keep this brief because I know how late it is. Within, and I'm speaking to commercial requirements citywide, but I realize we're constrained to the urban villages in this discussion. There is no single greater impediment in this general plan to the development of 100% affordable housing than the substantially replaced requirement of commercial that's currently in the GP. Nonprofit developers and affordable housing developers have no financial resources to cover commercial space, especially in areas with high commercial vacancy. I appreciate staff's recommendation to reduce that requirement to 50%. However, I don't think that goes far enough. I think it's interesting that staff brought up the Blossom Hill Senior Housing Project and Destination Home, and the Coalition of Supportive Housing Developers referenced it in their memo. That 50% requirement still necessitated 16,000 feet of commercial square footage in development, and $6 million that the developer has no source to pay for. The area where that development is occurring is a high vacancy area, and it cost the development over 40 units of deeply affordable housing that could have otherwise been created for seniors. I think in the case of 100% affordable housing development, given the gravity and the severity of our affordable housing crisis and the homelessness in our community, we have to consider the elimination of any commercial requirement for 100% affordable housing development in this plan. And I make that motion to approve staff's recommendation with the amendment of the elimination.
Striking number 2? Is that it, just for clarification, strike number 2 in that policy?
Change number 2 to the elimination. So does not adapt and shall replace none of the existing commercial square footage.
Well, couldn't you accomplish the same thing by
Or
just
eliminate.
deleting?
Yeah, you're right, yes,
Okay.
just right. Yeah.
Okay, so the motion is to approve, the motion's to approve the policy with items 1 and 3. That's your second, Kevin? Or Michael? Okay. All right. Discussion on the motion. Anyone care to comment on that? I think we had a, if it's just agreeing with Ray, let's, yeah, do that. Yeah. Thanks, Shiloh. Are you agreeing with that, Leslie?
Well, yes, I agree with Ray, except for one thing, is that I go back to what the council policy direction was in the housing crisis work plan, which was that this was to be looked at citywide and not just in the urban villages. If all we're looking at today is in the urban villages, I still think we have to bring back at a later meeting the conversation for commercial beyond that. So I agree totally. Building commercial, having commercial requirements in affordable housing has been a more recent phenomenon. And what we've found is that we have a lot of commercial space that's vacant. And in fact, Silicon Valley at Home tried to move into some vacant space in an affordable housing development, and we were told that the TI for us to move in was $400,000. Shiloh down the way tried to do the same in the same building, and in 2 years' time, the TI had increased to $700,000. Affordable housing developers cannot pay that price. It's why it ends up being vacant. So the idea that the reduction be 50%, it doesn't resolve the overall problem, which is that 50% then would sit there and still be a drain and still be a problem for affordable housing development. So I agree with Ray.
So you're agreeing with Ray. You're supposed to do that.
No, I do, except I think that this is too narrow.
I do
So-
see that. And the planning director pointed out to me while you were making that comment that the council direction, consistent with what Councilmember Davis had said earlier, was we do have a direction to look at commercial space requirements for affordable developments, not just in urban villages. So yes, so we will have to bring that back for some further discussion. All right, with that understanding, all in favor of the motion?
Aye.
All opposed? Okay, Member Flores? Yes, go ahead.
I do understand that we are in a housing crisis. I just want to give an example here. On Allenbrook, between 22nd Street and Jackson, there are about 13 proposed developments. Most of them are affordable. These developments will be displacing almost 100 small businesses, local family-owned businesses. All of these are residents of our city as well. So when they displace these businesses, they displace families as well. When we don't require commercial to this affordable, even though they are affordable, we're not giving an opportunity for those businesses to either come back or have a place to move when these buildings are completed. I know it's possible. I know it's hard, but it's also possible. There are 2 developments happening in Allenbrook right now that are approved. One of them will provide not enough commercial as we ask for, but they will provide a little bit of commercial. Probably, I believe it's like 30% of the the bottom floor. Again, I believe that eliminating commercial on all these developments will be very detrimental, specifically in some areas. There might be areas where it will not affect, and I do, and I want to make clear of that, I do want to support housing everywhere we can. But there are areas where small businesses or local family-owned businesses will suffer, especially because of this requirement or elimination.
I think what we can do is take your concerns into account in the discussion we're not getting to tonight, which is residential uses in neighborhood business districts. We certainly can address that when we come back with that discussion in the future. We're not going to be able to get to it tonight. You know, I've been looking at that clock, and I kept thinking, boy, this meeting's going slow. And then oh no. Jim?
Thank you. I appreciate your comments. I'm glad you brought it up, but I'm also going to bring up the walkability aspect, because when you take away the commercial, then you might have the issue of taking out basic services that are normally available for the residents in that area, and you end up with them having to go much further out, which means they need transportation, et cetera. So I very much see what you're saying. We have to balance the ability to provide the services that are necessary for those people, especially the fact that they are in such a situation of financial situation, so they need that local service support.
Okay, thanks, everybody, for their participation tonight and working
David, I got
together to
one
develop a
comment.
consensus. Our next meeting is going to be...
David, I just have one quick comment,
Really?
I think. Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm sorry to keep everybody going. I think a couple of things came out from the conversation around the last two items, which is, I think, what we want the streetscape to look like and what kind of businesses and commercial space and the kind of ground floor experience we want to have, especially in the most active areas of our city, including around Alum Rock or Japantown or downtown or in Willow Glen. We've seen commercial corridors work really well. We've seen commercial corridors work not really well, and I know there's been some study around that for the downtown retail corridors, but I don't think we have a fully integrated retail strategy for the entire city. I 100% support the elimination of this requirement for 100% affordable projects, but I think especially for elected officials in the city, we really need to start thinking about how do we actually help incentivize small businesses, cultural institutions, or active uses for the commercial real estate that we do have in the city that's already existing, and how do we help incentivize having more, right? Because I think we're not just trying to house people, we're trying to make sure that they're living in complete communities. Thank you.
Our next meeting is Thursday, February 27th. Thank you, everyone.